It began with a wind that should not have meant anything. A cold December wind sweeping through the evergreens of the Ardennes, rustling branches that had stood for decades without caring about the world's wars or the ambitions of the soldiers who passed beneath them. But that wind carried something different now, a strange tension, a quiet urgency, the feeling that the forest was holding its breath. The Losheim Gap sat at the edge of that forest, like a doorway, carved by nature itself, a shallow depression in the land, a corridor of fields and villages stretching between ridges that rose like dark shoulders on either side. It did not look dangerous, it did not look strategic, it looked simple, quiet, rural. But through that quiet, armies had passed for centuries, because the land demanded it. Roads converged there, valleys opened there, and in December of 1944, the German army chose that gap as one of the places where it would try to force history into reversing itself. The Americans holding the Losheim Gap were not prepared for what approached them. They were tired, spread thin, manning quiet positions that had seen no action for weeks. Some believed the war was nearly over. Some thought they might soon be sent home. Some spent those early December nights sitting beside stoves, writing letters, repairing worn boots, sipping bitter coffee that tasted slightly of smoke. The forest around them seemed peaceful, too peaceful, but beyond those trees, German units gathered under strict silence, tanks hidden beneath camouflage nets, vehicles muffled with branches, infantry moving in darkness, officers whispering orders that blended into the rustling pine needles overhead. A massive force waiting for the signal to strike. The Losheim Gap would be one of the first places to feel that strike. On the night before the offensive, the fog thickened until it became a second sky pressed against the ground. Frost crawled across the fields. The roads glittered faintly in the dim moonlight. In the villages scattered along the gap, lights flickered behind shuttered windows, unaware of the storm forming in the forests above. And then, before dawn, the artillery began. It rolled across the landscape like the roar of an ancient beast, shaking walls, rattling dishes, tearing apart the silence that had blanketed the region. The first shells slammed into American positions with terrifying accuracy. Earth erupted. Snow flew into the air in violent bursts. Communication lines snapped. Outposts vanished. Men stumbled from bunkers, disoriented, clutching rifles, unable to see more than a few yards ahead. The German infantry surged forward behind that bombardment, moving through the trees with speed and coordination sharpened by months of preparation. They knew the terrain, they knew their objectives, they understood the importance of opening a path through the Losheim Gap for the armoured divisions behind them. To them, speed was everything. Hesitation was defeat. The Americans, shocked and scattered, attempted to form lines in the dark, but darkness belonged to the attackers. As the morning light crept across the ridges, it revealed a battlefield transformed into chaos. Snow churned by boots and treads, smoke rising in thin grey sheets. Vehicles overturned on icy roads. Radio messages breaking apart into fragments of distress. Units cut off from one another in the confusion. Yet even in those early moments, small groups of American soldiers held stubbornly. They fought from behind stone walls, from inside farmhouses, from ditches filled with freezing water. They fired into the fog, not always knowing what they were shooting at, only that something was coming, something large, something relentless. The German advance pressed through villages like Krewinkel and Lanzerath, where resistance was fierce but hopelessly outnumbered. In the dense woods above the gap, reconnaissance units clashed with paratroopers, whose discipline made them especially dangerous in terrain this tight and shadowed. Every tree seemed to hide a threat, every sound hinted at movement. Every branch snapping underfoot could have meant help arriving or doom closing in. The Losheim Gap became a funnel of desperation, a place where German momentum built like a rising tide, and American positions were swept backward by the force of it. But the terrain fought both sides. Roads clogged with vehicles, tanks slid on ice, fog hid crossroads. Artillery observers could not see their targets. Miscommunication haunted every plan. The battle was not clean. It was not simple. It was not fast. It was a struggle shaped by weather, geography, exhaustion, and the unpredictable rhythm of war. As the German forces finally pushed through the gap, the pressure they created rippled outward, igniting chaos across the northern flank of the Ardennes. The Losheim Gap became the first crack in the Allied front, the opening act of the larger storm, the Battle of the Bulge. But for those who fought here, it was not a prelude. It was a world unto itself, a place where small units held ground against overwhelming force, a place where the outcome was uncertain with every passing hour, a place where history turned not with a shout but with a shiver through the trees. Tonight we return to that moment, to the dark forest thick with fog, to the frozen roads leading into uncertainty, to the pine branches shaking under the distant thunder of artillery, to the soldiers who stood in the path of a tide that seemed impossible to stop. Before we drift deeper into their story, I want to ask you something gentle, something only you can answer. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what hour rests quietly around you? Is it late where you are, calm, wrapped in soft shadows, or are you somewhere where the night still lingers before sleep arrives? And something deeper shaped only for this episode. The Losheim Gap shows us how sometimes a small place, a narrow passage, becomes the center of everything. In your own life, has there ever been a moment where a small decision, a single choice, a tiny turning changed the direction of your path? If you feel comfortable, share what that moment taught you. And if these long, atmospheric journeys through the past help your thoughts slow, your breath deepen, and your mind soften toward rest, consider subscribing. December 10th, 1944. A convoy of trucks winds through the frozen hills of eastern Belgium, carrying men who joke about winning the war's lottery. The soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Golden Lions, peer through canvas flaps at a landscape of snow-dusted pines and silent villages. They've been in Europe less than a week. Their destination is a sector veterans call the Ghost Front, where nothing ever happens, where you can almost forget there's a war on. In the lead truck, a 19-year-old private from Indiana writes a letter home promising he'll be safe here. Behind him, the Losheim Gap waits like a loaded weapon nobody remembers, is pointed at their heads. The Ardennes forest in December of 1944 seemed like the least likely place for anything important to occur. American commanders had designated this 85-mile stretch of Belgian woodland as a rest sector, a place to give green troops their first taste of the front without real danger, where exhausted veterans could recover before being sent back to the real fighting. The forests were dense, the roads poor, the weather miserable, all factors that military doctrine said would prevent any serious offensive action. General Omar Bradley himself had described this sector as a calculated risk, acknowledging it was thinly held but believing the terrain made it unsuitable for major operations. What none of them seemed to remember, or perhaps what none of them had ever learned, was that German armies had used this exact corridor twice before in living memory. In 1870, Prussian forces had swept through these hills toward France. In 1914, the Schlieffen Plan had depended on this natural gap between highlands. The Losheim Gap wasn't just a quiet sector, it was a highway that history had marked with blood. And in December of 1944, the Americans had parked their most vulnerable units directly in its path. The 14 Cavalry Group held the center of this sleepy front, and their situation looked reasonable on paper but suicidal in practice. Colonel Mark Devine's cavalrymen were responsible for defending a 9-mile stretch of frontier, roughly 3 times the distance doctrine recommended for a cavalry unit. Instead of one soldier every 10 yards, the standard for an active defensive position, Devine had 1 man for every 50 yards of front. His headquarters sat in Manderfeld, a village so far behind what everyone assumed were secure lines that staff officers could walk to the local Gasthaus for beer. The cavalrymen themselves were spread across a network of small villages and observation posts, connected by telephone lines strung through the trees and by radio sets that worked poorly in the mountainous terrain. They were a screening force, meant to provide early warning of enemy activity, not to fight a major battle. But screening forces only work when someone behind them is prepared to respond to their warnings. And in December of 1944, nobody was listening. The 106th Division had arrived to take over positions on either side of Devine's cavalry, and they brought with them all the confidence and none of the experience that defines new units in wartime. These men had trained together in the American Midwest, had crossed the Atlantic expecting to join the final push into Germany, had been told they were going to a quiet sector to learn the ropes. Their division commander, Major General Alan Jones, was a capable officer facing an impossible situation. 2 of his 3 regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, were positioned on a forested ridge called the Schnee Eifel, which jutted eastward into German-held territory, like a thumb poking into a hornet's nest. This positioning meant the regiments were actually ahead of the main American lines, surrounded on 3 sides by terrain the Germans controlled. Jones knew this was dangerous, had argued for a better position, but he'd been told to take over the existing defences without major changes. After all, this was the quiet sector. What could possibly go wrong? What made the situation even more precarious was that almost nobody in the American chain of command understood the historical significance of where they were standing. The Losheim Gap wasn't just a name on a map, it was a 6-mile-wide natural corridor between the Schnee Eifel ridge to the south and the Monschau forest to the north, a geological feature that channeled military movement the way a river valley directs water. Any competent German staff officer looking at a map would immediately recognize it as the obvious place to attack the weak joint in the American armor. But the Americans in December of 1944 were focused on their own offensives, on Montgomery's push in the north toward the Ruhr industrial region, on Patton's drive toward the Saar in the south. The Ardennes was the place between the action held by just enough troops to maintain a presence, defended by soldiers who were either too inexperienced or too exhausted to fight effectively. It was, in the dry language of military planning, an acceptable risk. Intelligence reports had been accumulating through November and early December, like snow gathering on a roof, and like snow on a roof. Everyone assumed it would just stay there harmlessly until it melted away. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Patterson, the 106th Division's intelligence officer, had filed 8 separate reports in 10 days, noting suspicious German activity across the lines. Patrols reported hearing vehicle noises at night, seeing occasional German soldiers in unusual uniforms, capturing prisoners who seemed better fed and equipped than usual. On December 14th, a cavalry patrol near Losheim village captured 2 German soldiers wearing American uniforms, carrying American weapons, speaking fluent English. The patrol commander filed a report describing the incident. It was marked as an isolated occurrence, possibly saboteurs, nothing to suggest a larger operation. Nobody connected it to the vehicle noises, the improved prisoner quality, the other small anomalies. Each piece of information sat in its own filing cabinet, and nobody stepped back far enough to see the picture they formed together. The men themselves felt something was wrong, even if they couldn't articulate what. Private Robert Newborough, manning an observation post in the hills above Losheim village, wrote in his diary about how quiet the German side had become in recent days. Usually you could hear occasional artillery fire, see smoke from villages behind German lines, watch the routine of an army at rest. But starting around December 10th, the German side went silent. No artillery, no visible movement, just forest and fog and an absence of sound that felt heavier than noise. Newborough mentioned it to his sergeant, who mentioned it to his lieutenant, who included it in a daily report that went to battalion, then to regiment, then to division, where it joined the stack of other reports that suggested something unusual was happening. Years later, survivors would talk about this feeling, this sense that the forest was holding its breath. But in December of 1944, feelings didn't override the official assessment. The Ghost Front was quiet because nothing was happening. The intelligence reports showed scattered, low-level activity. The higher headquarters were focused elsewhere. Everything was fine. Life in the sector had settled into a comfortable routine by mid-December, the kind of rhythm that soldiers fall into when they stop expecting combat. In Manderfeld, Colonel Devine's headquarters staff had established a regular schedule: morning briefings, afternoon position checks, evening reports up the chain of command. In the villages along the front, cavalrymen pulled guard duty in shifts, maintained their vehicles, wrote letters home. The 106th Division troops on the Schnee Eifel cleared snow from their foxholes, tried to stay warm in bunkers the previous occupants had built, and counted days until Christmas. Officers in the rear areas at St. Vith, where division headquarters sat, and farther back at Bastogne, where 8th Corps Commander General Troy Middleton oversaw the entire Ardennes sector, focused on logistics, on getting winter equipment forward, on planning for future operations. On December 15th, division headquarters sent out a memo reminding all units about proper procedures for Christmas gift packages. That same day, several officers received approval for passes to Paris, scheduled to begin December 17th. Nobody cancelled the passes. Nobody suggested Christmas might be interrupted. The temperature on the evening of December 15th dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that soldiers on guard duty stamped their feet and breathed into their hands, creating small clouds of vapour that disappeared into darkness. Across the lines, Invisible in the forests and villages of Germany just a few miles away, men were receiving final briefings for an operation that would begin in less than 12 hours. But on the American side, the night was quiet. In Manderfeld, Colonel Devine reviewed the day's patrol reports over coffee, found nothing alarming, and authorized the night duty officer to wake him only if something significant occurred. In St. Vith, General Jones spoke by telephone with Corps headquarters about a routine supply issue, then went to bed. Along the actual front line, in observation posts and forward positions scattered through the hills, American soldiers stared into darkness and saw nothing, heard nothing, suspected nothing. Private Newborough, in his observation post above Losheim, wrote one final diary entry before trying to sleep. Another quiet night on the Ghost Front. Getting so boring I almost wish something would happen. In approximately 6 hours, he would regret that wish with every fibre of his being. The night passed slowly, marked by the hourly reports at checkpoints sent back through communication networks, each message confirming that all was normal, all was quiet, all was as it should be. At 4:30 in the morning on December 16th, the overnight duty officer at division headquarters noted in the log that all positions had reported in, with nothing unusual to report. 30 minutes later, there was still nothing. Across the entire Ghost Front, from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, the night duty officers recorded the same thing: quiet sector, no activity, routine night. At 5:15, one of the last reports came in from an observation post near Losheim village. All quiet on the Western Front, the radio operator joked, making a literary reference none of his companions recognized. 50 minutes later, the Western Front would become anything but quiet. 50 minutes later, the world would explode, and the men of the Losheim Gap would learn that quiet sectors don't exist in war. There are only sectors where the enemy hasn't attacked yet. And on the morning of December 16th, 1944, the enemy was about to attack with a force and fury that would turn the Ghost Front into a very real nightmare. September 16th, 1944, Colonel General Alfred Jodl walks through the entrance of the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified headquarters in East Prussia, carrying a leather portfolio he hasn't opened yet but knows will change the course of the war. Inside, handwritten on paper bearing the Führer's personal letterhead, are orders for something Jodl considers either brilliant or insane, possibly both. Hitler has summoned him to discuss a counteroffensive in the West, and Jodl has learned not to question these summons, not to suggest that perhaps Germany's strategic situation doesn't permit offensive operations, not to mention that every reserve division Hitler wants to commit to this attack might be better used defending against the Soviet steamroller grinding toward Berlin from the east. You bring the maps Hitler asks for, you work the problem he wants solved, you keep your doubts to yourself and your pistol loaded in case the Reich's collapse requires final solutions. The idea had been forming in Hitler's mind since the Americans broke out of Normandy in early August, since the Wehrmacht's catastrophic defeat in France, since the retreat that everyone called strategic withdrawal but that Hitler recognized as a rout. Where others saw disaster, Hitler saw possibility. The Allies were advancing on two divergent axes, Montgomery pushing northeast toward the Ruhr industrial region, Patton driving east toward the Saar and the Rhine. This divergence created a gap, a weak seam in the Allied lines, and Hitler's strategic instincts, which had proven both brilliant and catastrophic at different times, told him this gap represented opportunity. If Germany could mass sufficient force at the weakest point in Allied lines, achieve surprise, and execute a rapid breakthrough, they could split the Allied armies, capture their supply depots, perhaps even reach the port of Antwerp. Such a victory wouldn't win the war. Hitler wasn't delusional enough to think that anymore, but it might force the Americans and British to negotiate, might buy time to develop the miracle weapons, might shift enough force eastward to stabilize the Russian front, or it might burn the last mobile reserves in a desperate gamble, leaving Germany defenseless. Hitler didn't care about the second possibility. The planning began in absolute secrecy, with a compartmentalization so extreme that even field marshals commanding armies in the West weren't initially informed. Hitler designated the operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive-sounding name designed to mislead Allied intelligence. Any intercepted references would suggest Germany was preparing to defend the Rhine River, not planning to attack through Belgium. The planning staff was limited to fewer than a dozen officers, all working in isolation, forbidden from discussing their work even with colleagues. Documents were handwritten rather than typed to prevent secretaries from learning details. Maps were disguised or coded. The entire apparatus of German military planning, normally a collaborative process involving multiple headquarters and staff sections, was reduced to a handful of men sketching arrows on maps in a bunker while Allied bombs fell overhead. And at the center of it all sat Hitler himself, hunched over maps, tracing routes with his finger, insisting on details that experienced officers thought impossible, overruling objections with the same iron will that had conquered most of Europe, and that was now about to destroy what remained of the German army. The plan that emerged was, by any objective standard, extraordinarily ambitious given Germany's situation in autumn of 1944. Hitler demanded nothing less than a replay of May 1940, the Ardennes offensive that had cut through Allied lines and reached the English Channel in days, splitting the French and British armies and leading to France's surrender. This time, the objective was Antwerp, the massive Belgian port through which most Allied supplies flowed. 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, would form the main effort, smashing through the Ardennes north of the Losheim Gap, then driving northwest to cross the Meuse River and race for Antwerp. 5th Panzer Army, under Husse von Manteuffel, would attack south of the Gap, protecting Dietrich's flank and capturing the road junction at Bastogne. 7th Army would form a defensive screen to the south, preventing American forces from counterattacking into the operation's southern flank. In total, Hitler planned to commit nearly 300,000 men, almost 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and thousands of artillery pieces. This represented virtually every mobile reserve Germany possessed, stripped from every other front, concentrated into 40 miles of Belgian forest for one massive throw of the dice. But the plan required more than just force. It required surprise, speed, and a specific point of attack where Allied defences were weakest. This is where the Losheim Gap entered German calculations with mathematical precision. Colonel Friedrich August Baron von der Heide, a Luftwaffe paratrooper tasked with planning airborne operations to support the offensive, later described studying intelligence maps with other planners and watching as they systematically eliminated potential attack routes. The northern Ardennes, near Aachen, was too heavily defended. American 9th Army had divisions packed densely there. The southern Ardennes, near Luxembourg, was held by Patton's 3rd Army, and nobody wanted to attack Patton if they could avoid it. But the centre, around the Losheim Gap, looked perfect. Aerial reconnaissance showed thinly spread defensive positions. Radio intelligence had identified the newly arrived 106th Division, an inexperienced unit. Prisoner interrogations revealed low morale among American cavalry units stretched beyond their capacity. And the terrain, the very terrain American planners thought prevented offensive operations, actually channeled armor perfectly once you broke through the initial crust of defenses. The gap itself was wide enough for multiple armored columns to advance simultaneously without congestion. German intelligence officers compiled detailed assessments of American defensive positions, and what they found must have seemed almost too good to be true. The 14 Cavalry Group held a 9-mile front, about 3 times what doctrine recommended. Behind them, the 106th Division was still settling into positions, hadn't completed defensive preparations, hadn't laid extensive minefields or prepared proper fallback positions. The American command structure in the Ardennes showed signs of complacency corps. Headquarters 40 miles behind the front, division headquarters 20 miles back, communication networks that depended on vulnerable telephone lines. German planners identified specific villages where they knew American supply dumps were located, specific crossroads where American units would have to retreat through if pushed, specific bridges whose capture or destruction would trap entire regiments. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, reviewing these intelligence summaries, later recalled thinking, either this information is completely wrong or the Americans have made a catastrophic deployment error. The information wasn't wrong. The force designated to exploit the Losheim Gap breakthrough represented the cream of what remained of German military power. 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler, the Führer's bodyguard division, expanded to full panzer strength, would lead 6th Panzer Army's attack. Within that division, Kampfgruppe Piper, commanded by 29-year-old SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, would form the spearhead of the spearhead. Piper was exactly the kind of officer this mission required, and exactly the kind who would later face war crimes trials. Aggressive, ruthless, experienced in combat on the Eastern Front, where the rules of civilized warfare had long since dissolved. His Kampfgruppe, combined arms task force built around a panzer regiment, included approximately 4,800 men, 100 tanks including the new King Tiger heavies, and 600 other vehicles. Their route, carefully plotted on maps at 6th Panzer Army headquarters, ran straight through the Losheim Gap, break through the cavalry screen, roll over the inexperienced infantry, capture the bridges over the Somme River, drive through St. Vith before the Americans could organise a defence, cross the Meuse at Huy, turn northwest toward Antwerp. The maps showed a red arrow that made it look simple, the way maps always do before soldiers start dying. But even as planning reached its final stages in November, cracks appeared in the operation's foundation that suggested it might fail before it began. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, submitted a written assessment that barely concealed its skepticism. He called the plan too ambitious for the forces available and suggested a more limited operation with achievable objectives. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, which would actually execute the offensive, agreed with von Rundstedt and said, so risking Hitler's wrath. Both marshals pointed out the same fundamental problems. The plan assumed perfect weather that would ground Allied air power, assumed capturing intact American fuel dumps because German logistics couldn't support the offensive past the first few days, assumed the Americans would be too surprised and disorganized to respond effectively. If any of these assumptions failed, the entire operation would collapse. Hitler listened to their objections, acknowledged their concerns, and ordered them to proceed exactly as he'd directed. The Führer had made his decision. The pieces were moving into position, and the Losheim Gap was about to become the hinge on which Germany's final gamble would turn. The final planning conference took place on December 12th, 4 days before the offensive, at Model's headquarters near Münstereifel. Division commanders gathered in a room where guards stood outside the doors to prevent anyone from entering or leaving during the briefing. Maps covered the walls, each showing different aspects of the operation: assembly areas, attack routes, objectives for each day, locations of American units. Model himself conducted the briefing, walking through the plan step by step with the deliberate precision of a professional soldier who knows he's been ordered to attempt the impossible, but who will do his duty anyway. He pointed to the Losheim Gap on the main map. Here, he said, is where we break them. Not just break through, break them. Shatter their fronts so completely they cannot recover. He explained how the initial artillery barrage would pulverize American positions, how infiltration teams would cut communications, how the assault divisions would pour through the gap before the Americans understood what was happening. 6th Panzer Army staff officers distributed timetables showing how many miles each unit should advance each day. The numbers were staggering: 10 miles the first day, 15 the second, 20 the third. Panzer commanders looked at these figures and said nothing, because by December of 1944, German officers had learned that questioning Hitler's plans was both futile and dangerous. The last 72 hours before the offensive saw a concentration of military power along the German side of the frontier that was impressive despite Germany's declining resources. Under cover of darkness, panzer divisions moved into assembly areas in the forests east of the Losheim Gap. Artillery units registered their guns on American positions, calculating exact firing data for the bombardment that would begin the offensive. Assault infantry infiltrated forward to within a few hundred yards of American lines, close enough to hear English voices, to see the glow of cigarettes in the darkness, to count the seconds until they would rise from frozen ground and charge. The entire German war machine, bleeding from a dozen wounds inflicted by 2 years of retreat, gathered itself for one final lunge at victory. In command posts scattered through the Eifel forest, officers synchronized watches, reviewed attack orders one last time, and tried not to think about the fact that if this operation failed, nothing stood between the Allies and the Rhine except exhausted divisions and the memory of power. At midnight on December 15th, with 5.5 hours until the artillery barrage began, an SS officer near Losheim wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we attack. Either we reach Antwerp and change the war, or we die in Belgium and the war is over. I suppose we'll know which in a few days." The war was about to come to the Ghost Front with a violence that would make the past 4 years of fighting seem like preparation for one terrible morning. December 10th, 1944, afternoon. Colonel Benjamin Dixon, known throughout First Army as Monk, for his serious demeanour and priest-like dedication to intelligence work, sits at his desk in First Army headquarters, reviewing prisoner interrogation reports. from the previous 48 hours. The reports describe something unusual, something that makes the back of his neck prickle with the instinct intelligence officers develop after years of separating signal from noise. German prisoners captured in recent days are better fed than usual, better equipped, less willing to talk. These aren't the hollow-eyed boys and old men who've been surrendering since Normandy. These are frontline troops, confident troops, troops who act like they know something the Americans don't. Dixon marks the reports with red pencil, adds them to a growing stack of documents on his desk, and begins drafting an intelligence estimate that his superiors will dismiss, that headquarters will file away, and that soldiers will die without reading. The machinery of Allied intelligence in December 1944 was simultaneously the most sophisticated information-gathering apparatus in military history and a bureaucratic nightmare that filtered out inconvenient truths. At the top sat Ultra, the British code-breaking operation that could read high-level German communications in near real time. Below that, aerial reconnaissance photographed German-held territory daily, weather permitting. Signals intelligence intercepted and analysed radio traffic. Prisoner interrogations provided ground-level tactical information. Belgian and French resistance networks reported German movements. American forward observers watched the front through binoculars and telescopes. All of this information flowed upward through channels that were supposed to synthesize it, analyze it, and produce actionable intelligence for commanders. Instead, the information got stuck in institutional assumptions that had hardened into fact. Germany was defeated, incapable of major offensive operations, focused on defending the Rhine. Any evidence that contradicted this assessment was interpreted through that lens until it fit the narrative or was dismissed as anomalous. Dixon's estimate would run headlong into those assumptions like a car hitting a wall. The estimate he completed on December 10th, officially titled Capabilities of the Enemy on Our Front, pulled together dozens of separate intelligence threads into a conclusion that should have alarmed everyone who read it. Dixon documented increased German air reconnaissance over American positions in the Ardennes, suggesting unusual interest in a supposedly quiet sector. He noted the appearance of new German divisions opposite 8th Corps, units identified as coming from Germany's strategic reserve rather than from the existing front line. He described the improved quality of German prisoners, the aggressive patrolling activity, the reduction in German artillery fire that suggested they were stockpiling ammunition, and he made a prediction. It is plain that the enemy's strategy in defense of the Reich is based on the exhaustion of our offensive, to be followed by an all-out counterattack with armor between the Ruhr and the Erft, supported by every weapon he can bring to bear. The estimate didn't predict exactly where the attack would fall, but it explicitly warned that Germany was preparing a major offensive operation somewhere on the Western Front. The response from higher headquarters was swift. Dixon was told his estimate was too pessimistic and was sent on leave to Paris, departing on December 15th. He wouldn't be present when his predictions came true less than 24 hours later. Ultra-intelligence, which should have provided strategic warning, instead created false confidence through a combination of German operational security and Allied misinterpretation. The Germans had maintained extraordinary communication discipline during their build-up, using landlines and motorcycle couriers rather than radio for most operational orders. What radio traffic existed was encrypted with Enigma machines, but the messages were routine administrative communications that gave no hint of offensive preparations. British intelligence analysts at Bletchley Park, reviewing the decrypted traffic, saw nothing alarming. What they missed, what the system wasn't designed to detect, was absence. Normally, the Germans generated steady volumes of tactical radio traffic. In late November and early December, that traffic decreased significantly opposite the Ardennes, not because units were leaving, but because they'd been ordered to maintain radio silence. The analysts reading those intercepts should have asked why a quiet sector was becoming even quieter. Instead, reduced German communications was interpreted as evidence that nothing was happening, when it actually meant the opposite. The system designed to provide perfect intelligence created perfect blindness. Aerial reconnaissance produced photographs that clearly showed German preparations, but nobody looked at them correctly. On December 9th, American reconnaissance aircraft photographed the Eifel region behind German lines and captured images of military vehicles, artillery positions, and supply dumps. The photographs went to photo interpretation units, where analysts counted the vehicles, measured the artillery concentrations, and noted the increase in activity. Their reports went into the intelligence pipeline and were interpreted as defensive preparations, Germany strengthening their Rhine defenses, exactly what American commanders expected to see. Nobody compared the December 9th photographs to images from November and noticed that the concentration of forces had doubled. Nobody plotted the locations of the new artillery positions and realized they were positioned to fire westward, not eastward. Nobody noticed that the vehicle parks were located in forests near the frontier, not back near the Rhine where defensive reserves should have been. The photographs contained all the evidence necessary to predict the German offensive, but evidence only works when someone looks for it. And in December 1944, Allied intelligence was looking in the wrong direction. The human intelligence, network spies, resistance fighters, civilian observers provided perhaps the clearest warnings, and these warnings were the most thoroughly ignored. On December 14th, a Luxembourgish woman approached American military police with information she insisted was urgent. She counted hundreds of German vehicles moving west through the forest near her village. More military traffic than she'd seen since the German retreat in September. The MPs took her report and passed it to the intelligence section, where it sat awaiting translation, because no one who spoke Luxembourgish was immediately available. By the time someone translated it, the offensive had begun. On December 15th, a Belgian resistance operative named Elise de Prez, who'd been monitoring German movements near St. Vith, compiled a detailed report describing the arrival of new German divisions, the positioning of assault boats along the Our River, and preparations that looked exactly like what she'd seen before the German invasion of Belgium in 1940. Her report reached the American legation in Brussels, was forwarded to British intelligence, was evaluated as possibly significant, and began working its way through channels that would deliver it to 8th Corps headquarters approximately 3 days after it would have been useful. At every level of command, intelligence officers saw pieces of the picture without seeing the whole. At regiment level, Battalion S, 2 intelligence officers reported unusual German activity, aggressive patrols, artillery, registration fire, occasional German soldiers in American uniforms. Their reports went to division intelligence sections, where they were collated with similar reports from other regiments and forwarded to Corps. At Corps level, 8th Corps intelligence section noted the increase in German activity, but assessed it as routine defensive preparations or possibly limited spoiling attacks to disrupt American offensive preparations. Their assessment went to 1st Army, where Dixon's intelligence section saw the broader pattern but whose warnings were dismissed. And at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles, far from the front intelligence staff were focused on supporting Montgomery's planned offensive north of Aachen and Patton's operations in the Saar. The Ardennes was the economy sector, held with minimum force, while attention focused elsewhere. When lower-level intelligence officers suggested increased German activity in the Ardennes might be significant, the response was essentially, that's why we're keeping minimum forces there. It's a quiet sector where nothing is happening. The institutional culture of Allied intelligence in December 1944 had been shaped by months of success that bred overconfidence. Since the breakout from Normandy in August, the Allies had advanced hundreds of miles, liberated France and Belgium, reached Germany's western frontier. Every day brought new evidence of German weakness, prisoners who were too young or too old, equipment that was obsolete or poorly maintained, defensive positions that crumbled under pressure. Intelligence officers had stopped looking for signs of German strength because they'd stopped believing Germany possessed any strength worth worrying about. A young captain in 1st Army Intelligence Section later described the mindset, we'd been chasing a beaten enemy for 4 months. Every piece of intelligence was filtered through that lens. German tanks massing somewhere? They must be preparing to retreat. German infantry moving at night? They're shifting defensive positions. German communications going silent? They're beaten and disorganized. We were so convinced we'd already won that we couldn't imagine they might still be capable of fighting. This institutional overconfidence meant that when intelligence officers like Dixon tried to sound the alarm, their warnings sounded like pessimism or defeatism rather than reasonable analysis. The final failure, the failure that rendered all the collected intelligence useless, was the failure of information flow and command attention. Even if every intelligence report had been perfectly accurate and properly interpreted, the American command structure in December 1944 wasn't positioned to respond. General Middleton at 8th Corps headquarters in Bastogne commanded 4 divisions spread across 85 miles of front, with a corps staff designed for controlling 2 divisions across 30 miles. He had 3 intelligence officers for his entire corps, compared to the dozen or more a properly staffed corps would have. Division commanders like General Jones at the 106th Division headquarters were focused on immediate tactical concerns, getting their green troops trained, preparing defensive positions, managing supply difficulties. They didn't have time to read comprehensive intelligence estimates about theoretical German capabilities. And at the top, Eisenhower and his senior commanders were planning offensives, not worrying about defense. The entire Allied command structure in December 1944 was oriented toward attack, and you cannot see what you're not looking for. The Germans were coming, the signs were present, the warnings were issued, but nobody was listening. December 15th, 10 o'clock at night, in a modest apartment in Paris, Colonel Dixon unpacks his overnight bag, preparing to enjoy the leave his superiors insisted he take despite his protests. Back at 1st Army headquarters, a duty officer files the day's intelligence summary, noting no significant enemy activity. At 8 Corps headquarters in Bastogne, the night watch settles in for what they expect will be a quiet evening. In villages scattered across the Ardennes, American soldiers check their positions one last time, stamp their feet against the cold, and count hours until morning. And in forests just across the German frontier, assault troops crouch in frozen darkness, waiting for the artillery barrage that will begin in 7.5 hours. The intelligence failure is complete. Every warning sign that could have been detected has been detected and ignored. Every piece of information that could have revealed German intentions has been collected and filed away without action. The most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in military history has produced perfect ignorance at the exact moment perfect knowledge was required. In 600 years of military intelligence history, there have been many failures, but few have been so total, so avoidable, and so consequent as the failure to see what was coming to the Losheim Gap. December 16th, 1944, 5:28 in the morning, Private First Class Robert Newborough huddles in his observation post on a hill above Losheim village, trying to stay warm in the darkness before dawn. The temperature has dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that his breath freezes in the air, cold enough that the water in his canteen has turned to ice despite being inside his coat. He's been on watch since midnight. 4.5 hours of staring into blackness, seeing nothing, hearing nothing except wind through pine trees and the occasional rustle of small animals in underbrush. In 30 minutes, his replacement will arrive and he can return to the warmth of the bunker his squad has dug into the hillside. He thinks about coffee, about breakfast, about the letter he's writing to his girlfriend in Pennsylvania. He doesn't think about the 1,600 German artillery pieces being loaded and aimed at positions exactly like his across a 40-mile front. 2 minutes from now, he'll think about nothing except survival. The German artillery preparation began at precisely 5:30 a.m. with a coordination that was impressive even by Wehrmacht standards. From north of Monschau to south of Echternach, 1,600 guns opened fire simultaneously. Field artillery, heavy artillery, railway guns, mortars, and the multi-barreled Nebelwerfer rocket launchers that German soldiers called smoke throwers and that Allied soldiers called screaming mimes for the distinctive shriek they made in flight. The barrage had been meticulously planned, with each battery assigned specific American positions to destroy based on intelligence gathered over the previous weeks. Forward observation posts were targeted first to blind American units, then command posts to disrupt leadership, then communication centers to prevent coordination, then infantry positions to kill soldiers and destroy morale. The barrage wasn't random violence, it was systematic demolition of the American defensive network, executed with scientific precision. In the first 30 minutes, German artillery fired approximately 30,000 shells at American positions in the Ardennes. In the Losheim Gap sector specifically, where the 14 Cavalry Group's thin defensive line represented the main target, the concentration of fire reached levels not seen on the Western Front since the great offensives of World War I. Private Newborough was actually one of the lucky ones because his observation post sat on a hill that gave him a few seconds of warning. At 5:29 and 40 seconds, he heard a sound that he later described as like distant thunder, except it kept getting closer and louder until it wasn't like thunder anymore. It was like the earth screaming. He recognized it, artillery fire, a lot of artillery fire. more than he'd ever heard, and in the 3 or 4 seconds before the first shells landed, he managed to dive behind the log wall of his position and curl into the smallest shape possible. The hilltop around him simply disintegrated. High explosive shells turned trees into splinters and rock into shrapnel. The concussion from near misses lifted him off the ground and slammed him back down. Dirt and debris rained down continuously. The noise became physical, a pressure that made his ears ring and his teeth ache. Time stopped meaning anything. Was it 10 seconds or 10 minutes? And all he could do was press himself against frozen ground and pray that the next shell wouldn't land directly on his position. 100 yards behind him, his squad's bunker took a direct hit from a heavy shell that collapsed the roof and killed everyone inside instantly. Newborough wouldn't know that until later. Right now, knowing anything except that he was still alive was impossible. Across the entire Losheim Gap sector, the German barrage achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve: shock, destruction, and isolation. Telephone lines, strung through trees and along roads, were cut by tree bursts and shell fragments. Radio antennas were destroyed by direct hits. Command posts became death traps as German artillery walked fire across positions identified through aerial reconnaissance. In Manderfeld, Colonel Devine's 14 Cavalry Group headquarters took several hits that killed staff officers and destroyed communication equipment. In the forward villages, where cavalry troops were positioned, buildings collapsed, vehicles burned, and soldiers who'd been sleeping were buried alive in the rubble of their billets. The barrage lasted 90 minutes, and by the time it lifted at 7 a.m., the American defensive network in the Losheim Gap had effectively ceased to exist as an organized entity. Units were cut off from their parent headquarters. Company commanders couldn't communicate with battalion. Battalion commanders couldn't reach regiment. Everyone was alone in the darkness and fog, unable to see more than 100 yards, unsure if anyone else had survived, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was German assault infantry, advancing through fog and smoke, while American defenders were still stunned and disoriented from the artillery barrage. The Germans had trained for this extensively. Assault teams armed with machine guns, flamethrowers, and demolition charges, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, moving in small groups that bypassed American strongpoints rather than assaulting them directly. Their tactics came from lessons learned on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht had perfected the art of infiltration attacks that dissolved enemy defences rather than smashing through them. At Losheim village itself, the assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, with elements of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division supported by tanks from the 12th SS Panzer Division hitting American cavalry positions that had been hammered by 90 minutes of artillery fire. The American defenders, what was left of them, fought back with the desperate intensity of men who'd been caught completely by surprise. Machine guns opened fire from ruins of buildings. A cavalry platoon positioned its 3 M8 armoured cars to block a road and knocked out a German armoured car before being destroyed by tank fire. Individual soldiers threw grenades from shell holes and rubble piles, but the defence was fragmented, uncoordinated, and vastly outnumbered. The German operational plan had called for achieving surprise through a combination of methods that would have seemed paranoid if they hadn't worked perfectly. Hours before the artillery barrage began, German infiltration teams had crossed into American-held territory with specific missions: cut telephone lines, remove road signs, lay ambushes on key routes. Some of these teams wore American uniforms captured in previous fighting, spoke English, carried American weapons, and were virtually indistinguishable from American soldiers in the darkness and confusion. Their mission wasn't to fight, it was to create chaos, to make the Americans distrust their own communications, to turn every unexpected encounter into a potential disaster. At multiple locations in the Losheim Gap sector, these infiltration teams succeeded spectacularly. They cut the main telephone cable connecting Colonel Devine's headquarters to the 106th Division command post, forcing all communication to go through radio networks that were already overloaded. They removed directional signs at key crossroads, so when American reinforcements were ordered forward, they got lost in the dark. They set up fake checkpoints where they captured or killed American couriers carrying orders and reports. One team even managed to capture an American artillery forward observer, preventing artillery support from being called down on German assault formations during the critical first hours of the attack. Supporting the ground assault, though largely ineffective due to bad weather and poor navigation, was Operation Stürzer, a German paratrooper drop intended to seize key crossroads behind American lines and prevent reinforcements from reaching the breakthrough sectors. Approximately 1,200 German paratroopers from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division boarded transport aircraft on the night of December 15th, with orders to jump near the town of Eupen, about 10 miles behind American lines north of the Losheim Gap. The operation was a disaster almost from the start. Bad weather scattered the transport aircraft. Navigation errors, compounded by searchlights bouncing off low clouds, meant pilots couldn't find their drop zones. Paratroopers who did jump were scattered across a 50-mile area, with most landing nowhere near their intended targets. Some came down in German-held territory, some in no man's land, some in the midst of retreating American units who captured them. But even though Operation Stürzer failed to achieve its tactical objectives, it succeeded in creating confusion. American units that stumbled across German paratroopers reported enemy troops behind their lines, adding to the sense that the entire defensive position was collapsing and that escape routes might already be cut. By 8 o'clock in the morning, just 2.5 hours after the artillery barrage began, the American defensive position in the Losheim Gap had essentially collapsed. At Manderfeld, Colonel Devine was attempting to command a battle without communication with most of his units, without accurate information about German strength or positions, and without any guidance from division or corps headquarters because they didn't yet understand what was happening. Reports reaching his headquarters, those few that got through, painted a picture of disaster. Positions overrun, units retreating in disorder, German tanks advancing through fog. Devine faced the decision that would define his career and haunt him for the rest of his life. Try to hold positions that might already be lost, or order a withdrawal that would at least preserve some of his force. At 8:30 a.m., he made the decision. All 14 Cavalry Group units were ordered to withdraw to a new defensive line several miles to the west, abandoning Losheim and the other forward villages, giving up the observation posts and strong points they'd held for weeks. The withdrawal order went out by radio because telephone lines were cut, and not all units received it. Those that did retreated in whatever order they could manage, often under fire, leaving behind wounded who couldn't be moved, and equipment that couldn't be evacuated. Private Nubra, still alive in his shattered observation post, heard German voices speaking below his position around 9 o'clock. He didn't know that the withdrawal order had been given because his unit's radio was destroyed. He didn't know that his squad was dead in their collapsed bunker. All he knew was that staying in this position meant eventual capture or death. He waited until he couldn't hear voices anymore, then crawled out of his position and began moving west through the forest, avoiding roads, trying to find American lines that he hoped still existed somewhere behind him. He wasn't alone. Across the entire battlefield, small groups of American soldiers were making similar decisions, moving west because west was where safety should be, hoping they'd find friendly forces before German patrols found them. Some did, many didn't, and everywhere they looked, they saw the same thing. German soldiers advancing, American positions burning, the entire defensive line dissolving into chaos. The battle for the Losheim Gap was just hours old, and the Americans had already lost it. The only question now was whether they could escape the disaster they hadn't seen coming, whether they could form a new defensive line somewhere to the west, whether they could prevent this tactical defeat from becoming a strategic catastrophe. In villages behind the front, St. Vith, Bastogne, even Luxembourg City, American commanders were just beginning to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. And by the time they understood it, the Germans would be miles deeper into Belgium, driving toward objectives that suddenly seemed achievable, exploiting the greatest intelligence, failure, and tactical surprise of the entire war in Northwest Europe. December 16th, 1944, 8 o'clock in the morning, Major General Alan Jones stands in the operations room of his command post in St. Vith, staring at a map that is already becoming obsolete even as his staff updates it. The map shows German attacks marked with red arrows at several points along his division's front, but the arrows are based on reports that are anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours old, and Jones knows from experience that in modern warfare, 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. He's been trying to reach Colonel Devine at 14 Cavalry Group headquarters for 20 minutes, but the direct telephone line is dead and radio communication is spotty. Reports from his 2 forward regiments on the Schnee Eifel are contradictory. One says they're under artillery fire, another says they're being probed by infantry, a third says there's heavy fighting in the valley below their positions. None of them can see what's happening because of fog. Jones lifts the telephone to call his corps commander, General Troy Middleton in Bastogne, and realizes he doesn't actually know what to tell him yet, except that something is happening and it seems big. The American command structure in the Ardennes was designed for peacetime occupation duty or for slowly advancing through prepared defences, not for responding to a major enemy offensive. At each level of command, battalion, regiment, division, corps, army headquarters were positioned miles behind the front based on the assumption that the front would either stay static or move east, never west. The 106th Division headquarters in St. Vith was approximately 20 miles behind the frontline positions. 8th Corps headquarters in Bastogne was another 20 miles farther west. 1st Army headquarters was in Spa, Belgium, about 60 miles from the German assault areas. This meant that even routine information took time to flow up the chain of command, and in a crisis, when telephone lines were cut and radio channels were jammed with traffic, the information flow became glacial. Orders and reports moved at the speed of motorcycle couriers bouncing over icy roads through fog, often taking 3 to 4 hours to complete journeys that radio signals would have made instantaneously if anyone had been able to get radio communications working reliably. The system had worked fine when nothing was happening. Now that everything was happening at once, the system was failing catastrophically. General Middleton at Corps headquarters received his first indication that something unusual was happening at approximately 7:30 a.m. when a routine scheduled radio check with the 14 Cavalry Group failed to establish contact. This wasn't immediately alarming. Radio communications were always problematic in the Ardennes, and missed radio schedules happened regularly. But over the next hour, as more scheduled contacts failed and fragmentary reports began arriving about artillery fire and German attacks, Middleton began to understand he was facing something more than routine patrol activity. At 9:15, he managed to reach General Jones on a telephone line that was still functioning and had a conversation that was both tense and frustratingly vague. Jones reported German attacks across his entire divisional front, but couldn't provide specifics about German strength, exact locations, or whether his units were holding. Middleton asked the logical question, "Do you need reinforcements?" Jones gave the only answer he could, "I don't know yet. Can you send them anyway?" Middleton promised to see what was available, knowing that what was available might be nothing at all because all available reserves were committed to planned Allied offensives elsewhere. The decision-making cycle in the first hours of the German offensive became a cascade of delayed reactions, each delay compounding the others. At regimental level, battalion commanders couldn't reach their subordinate companies to find out what was happening, so they couldn't provide accurate information to regiment. At division level, regimental commanders couldn't give General Jones clear pictures of their situations, so Jones couldn't tell Middleton what Corps needed to know. At Corps level, Middleton couldn't give 1st Army Commander General Courtney Hodges a comprehensive assessment because he didn't have one. And at Army level, Hodges couldn't tell Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles, what was happening because his own information was hours out of date by the time it reached him. The fog of war is a cliche, but in the Ardennes on December 16th, it was literal fog combined with destroyed communications and institutional structures designed for different circumstances. Commanders were making decisions based on information that described a battlefield that no longer existed, and by the time they realized their decisions were based on outdated intelligence, the battlefield had changed again. By noon, some 12 hours after the German artillery barrage began, American commanders were beginning to grasp the scale of what they faced. Reports from across the 8 Corps front described German attacks that were clearly coordinated, clearly major operations, clearly not local spoiling attacks or patrol activity, but even understanding that this was a major offensive didn't immediately reveal what to do about it. At division level, commanders like General Jones faced the classic military dilemma: defend forward and risk being overrun, or withdraw to better positions and risk triggering a general collapse. At Corps level, Middleton had to decide where to commit his limited reserves, knowing that sending them to the wrong place might leave the right place undefended. At Army and Supreme Headquarters level, senior commanders faced even more difficult questions. Was this the main German effort, or a diversion from something even larger? Should forces be pulled from other sectors to reinforce the Ardennes, and if so, from where? The answers to these questions would determine whether the German offensive would be contained quickly or would become a genuine crisis. The personal dimension of command in crisis added another layer of complexity that is often forgotten in clinical historical analysis. General Jones was not just trying to manage a military situation, he was dealing with the knowledge that his own son, a lieutenant with the 423rd Infantry Regiment, was somewhere in the chaos on the Schnee Eifel, possibly under attack, possibly cut off, possibly in mortal danger. This personal stake didn't paralyze Jones, he was too professional for that, but it certainly affected his calculations about how aggressively to withdraw units, how much risk to accept in trying to maintain positions. Similarly, Colonel Devine at 14 Cavalry Group headquarters was operating under the psychological weight of knowing that his decision to withdraw from Losheim and other forward positions would be second-guessed, would potentially end his career, would mark him as the officer who retreated in the face of the enemy. These weren't abstract command decisions being made by men looking at maps in safety. These were life and death choices being made by officers who knew they'd be judged for them, whose own families and careers were on the line, who were doing their best in circumstances no one had prepared them for. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Colonel Devine made the second decision that would haunt him, ordering a further withdrawal from the intermediate positions his cavalry units had tried to hold, pulling back to Manderfeld itself and then potentially even farther west. The radio message he sent to his squadron commanders was brief. Situation deteriorating rapidly. Withdraw to Phase Line C. Execute immediately. Phase Line C was a line on map overlays that represented a fallback position several miles west of where his units currently were. Executing that withdrawal meant abandoning American wounded who couldn't be moved, destroying equipment that couldn't be evacuated, and accepting that the Losheim Gap was now fully in German hands. Devine understood the implications. He was opening a 6-mile wide corridor through which German armour could pour essentially unopposed. But the alternative was standing and fighting with units that were already shattered, disorganised, and out of communication with each other, which would likely result in their complete annihilation. A commander's duty is to preserve his force, to fight another day, not to sacrifice it in futile gestures. Devine made the militarily correct decision, that it was also the career-ending decision didn't make it wrong. At 6 o'clock that evening, General Jones finally got through to General Middleton on a functioning telephone line and had the conversation that commanders dread. "Sir," Jones said, "I need to report that the situation here is serious. The cavalry has withdrawn. My 2 regiments on the Schnee Eifel are being flanked on both sides. I'm getting reports of German tanks behind our forward positions. I need reinforcements, and I need them now." Middleton's response was the one Jones had feared. "Alan, I don't have reinforcements to send you. Everything is committed. You're going to have to hold with what you have." There was a pause, and then Middleton added the phrase that commanders say when they've nothing else to offer: "Hold at all costs." Jones understood what that meant. It meant that whatever happened in the next 24 to 48 hours, the 106th Division would have to handle it alone. It meant that the 2 regiments on the Schnee Eifel, approximately 9,000 men, including his son, were going to have to defend their positions without relief. It meant that the gap Devine's cavalry had been unable to hold was now Jones's problem, and he had no solution for it. Midnight on December 16th, approaching December 17th, in headquarters across the Ardennes, officers updated maps with information that was already 12 to 18 hours old. In St. Vith, General Jones stared at red arrows showing German penetrations that were certainly deeper than the map showed, trying to decide whether to order his forward regiments to withdraw or to maintain their positions. In Bastogne, General Middleton drafted messages to First Army requesting any available reinforcements, knowing that reinforcements were probably days away. In Spa, at First Army headquarters, operations officers were beginning to understand that what had seemed like local attacks in the morning was actually a major German offensive operation. And in Versailles, at Supreme Headquarters, staff officers were waking General Eisenhower to inform him that the Germans had attacked in the Ardennes with significant force. The first 24 hours of the Battle of the Bulge were ending, and the American command structure was only just beginning to comprehend what those 24 hours meant. In that time, the Losheim Gap had been breached, American defensive positions had been shattered, thousands of soldiers had been killed or captured, and the Germans had achieved the deepest penetration of Allied lines since Normandy. And because communication systems had failed, because information flow had been too slow, because commanders had been making decisions based on outdated intelligence, the American response had been reactive, fragmented, and ineffective. The next 72 hours would determine whether this penetration became a breakthrough that reached the Meuse River, or whether the Allies could throw together a defence that would contain it. But that determination would depend on actions that hadn't been taken yet, decisions that hadn't been made yet, and reinforcements that hadn't arrived yet. The chaos of command was only beginning. December 17th, 1944, 8 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel George de Chenot, commander of the 422nd Infantry Regiment, stands on a hilltop position, studying his map and trying to make sense of reports that seem impossible. During the night, German forces somehow got behind his regiment's positions, cutting the road back to St. Vith. To the north, he's getting reports of German tanks. To the south, more German forces. Dead ahead to the east, there's been steady German pressure against his frontline positions since yesterday morning. Deschenaux is an experienced officer who fought in North Africa, but what he's looking at on this map violates everything he knows about defensive warfare. His regiment, along with the 423rd Regiment to his south, is apparently being surrounded while they're still in their original defensive positions. They haven't withdrawn, they haven't been pushed back, they're exactly where they were 48 hours ago, and they're about to be trapped. The geography of the Schnee Eifel had always been problematic from a defensive standpoint, and now that geography was about to become a death sentence. The Schnee Eifel, translated as Snow Peak, was a ridge that ran roughly north-south, jutting eastward into German-held territory like a fist. The ridge itself was good defensive terrain, offering observation over the valleys on either side, but it created a salient, a bulge in the American lines that could be attacked from three sides. When the 106th Division took over these positions in early December, officers had noted this vulnerability, but higher headquarters had declined to authorize a withdrawal to better positions because, in the words of one staff officer, nothing's going to happen here anyway. The positions had been inherited from a previous unit, had been improved with bunkers and wire obstacles, and represented weeks of preparation work that seemed wasteful to abandon. So the two regiments stayed where they were, defending good terrain in a bad tactical situation, and now the Germans were doing exactly what military theory said they'd do. They were attacking around the salient rather than into it, cutting it off at its base. The mechanics of how the encirclement happened revealed both German tactical skill and American lack of mobile reserves. The German assault plan for this sector called for the 18th Volksgrenadier Division to attack the Schnee Eifel positions frontally, fixing the American regiments in place, while faster-moving armoured forces from the 66th Corps swept around both flanks. To the north, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division bypassed American positions and drove west toward Au and Schönberg, the villages through which roads ran from the Schnee Eifel back to St. Vith. To the south, the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division pushed through gaps in American lines. By the evening of December 16th, German forces held both villages, effectively cutting the two American regiments' only good withdrawal routes. American commanders didn't realize this yet because communication with forward units was limited and because the tactical situation was so fluid that positions changed hour by hour. But by the morning of December 17th, the trap was essentially closed, even if the men inside it didn't fully understand their situation. The first recognition that something was catastrophically wrong came through failed attempts at movement rather than through intelligence reports. On the morning of December 17th, a supply convoy attempted to move from St. Vith forward to the Schnee Eifel positions to deliver rations, ammunition, and medical supplies. The convoy, 15 trucks, escorted by 2 armoured cars, reached the village of Schönberg without incident, but was then fired on by German forces holding positions on the western edge of the village. The convoy commander, realising German forces were somehow behind the frontline positions, turned his trucks around and raced back toward St. Vith, losing 3 trucks in the process. His report, reaching division headquarters around 9 a.m, was the first concrete indication that the 2 regiments might be cut off. A similar incident occurred on the southern route, where an ambulance trying to evacuate wounded was captured by German soldiers who'd set up a checkpoint on what had been an American supply route 24 hours earlier. These small tactical incidents painted a picture that staff officers reviewing the map found almost unbelievable. Approximately 9,000 American soldiers, 2 entire infantry regiments plus attached artillery and support units were surrounded. The command decision about what to do with these encircled regiments became the most controversial aspect of the entire Losheim Gap battle, with repercussions that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. General Jones, at division headquarters in St. Vith, faced an agonizing choice with no good options. Option 1. Order the regiments to withdraw immediately, fighting their way through German positions that now blocked the roads back to American lines. This had the advantage of preventing the encirclement from solidifying, but the disadvantage that a fighting withdrawal under fire through unfamiliar terrain by inexperienced troops would likely result in heavy casualties and might dissolve into rout. Option 2. Order the regiments to hold their current positions while division organised a relief attack to open a corridor. This had the advantage of keeping the regiments organised and defensible, but the disadvantage that mounting a relief attack required forces Jones didn't have and time he didn't possess. Option 3. Leave the regiments where they were, let them form a defensive hedgehog, and hope that the wider Allied response would eventually relieve them. This was essentially betting that the German offensive would be contained quickly, which assumed facts not in evidence. Jones chose a version of Option 2, modified by circumstances he couldn't control. At 10 o'clock on December 17th, he radioed Colonel Deschenaux with orders to hold the current positions on the Schnee Eifel, while division organised an attack to relieve them. The relief attack would be conducted by the 7th Armoured Division, which 1st Army Headquarters had promised to send but which hadn't arrived yet and whose exact arrival time was unclear. The order to Deschenaux was explicit: hold at all costs, relief is coming. Similar orders went to Colonel Charles Cavender commanding the 423rd Regiment to the south. Both regimental commanders acknowledged the orders and began preparing their defences for what they expected would be a temporary encirclement lasting perhaps 24 to 48 hours. They consolidated their positions, rationed their supplies, organised perimeter defences, and waited for the relief that would arrive too late or not at all. What none of them knew yet was that the 7th Armoured Division's Combat Command B was stuck in traffic jams on roads clogged with retreating American units and Belgian refugees, and would take another 18 hours to reach St. Vith. By the time the relief force was ready to attack, the situation would have deteriorated to the point where relief was no longer possible. The soldiers on the Schnee Eifel spent December 17th watching their tactical situation deteriorate in slow motion. German forces continued to strengthen their positions around the base of the salient, making eventual breakout more difficult with each passing hour. American artillery positions, which had been firing in support of the forward infantry, began running low on ammunition because resupply convoys couldn't get through. Wounded soldiers filled aid stations that lacked supplies to treat them properly. Food supplies dwindled as units began rationing what they had left. The temperature dropped steadily through the day, reaching 10 degrees Fahrenheit by evening, and soldiers who'd been fighting for 36 hours without sleep began showing signs of exhaustion and cold injury. Radio communication with division headquarters became increasingly spotty as batteries died and couldn't be replaced. By nightfall on December 17th, the men on the Schnee Eifel were cold, hungry, low on ammunition, surrounded, and increasingly aware that something had gone terribly wrong with whatever plan was supposed to rescue them. December 18th brought the first serious German attempt to reduce the pocket from outside while tightening the encirclement from within. German artillery, which had been relatively quiet on the 17th while German forces manoeuvred, resumed heavy bombardment of American positions. German infantry probed the perimeter, testing for weak spots, forcing American units to expend precious ammunition on defensive fire. And German propaganda units began using loudspeakers to broadcast surrender demands in English, telling the surrounded Americans that resistance was futile, that they were cut off without hope of relief, that surrender would mean warm food and safety, while continued resistance meant death in the frozen hills. Most American soldiers ignored this propaganda, but the mere fact that Germans were broadcasting surrender demands indicated they knew exactly how bad the American situation was. Colonel Deschenaux, listening to these broadcasts from his command post, faced the question every commander of surrounded forces must face: at what point does continued resistance become murder rather than duty? The attempted breakout on the morning of December 19th was the moment when the situation transitioned from critical to catastrophic. Colonel Cavender, commanding the 423rd Regiment, received permission from General Jones to attempt fighting through to American lines if an opportunity presented itself. Cavender organised an attack toward Schönberg, hoping to punch through the German forces holding that village and open a corridor westward. The attack began at 8 a.m. with what remained of one infantry battalion attacking behind a preliminary artillery barrage. The attack ran into prepared German positions with machine guns, anti-tank guns, and armor support. American infantry made it to the edge of Schönberg before being stopped by fire so intense that further advance was impossible. The battalion commander, trying to organize a second assault, was killed by German mortar fire. The attack collapsed, with survivors falling back to their starting positions having suffered heavy casualties and gained nothing. For Cavender and Deschenaux, watching this attack fail, the implications were clear. They lacked the strength to break out, relief wasn't coming in time, and continuing resistance would only increase casualties without changing the outcome. The decision to surrender, made on the afternoon of December 19th, was one of the most agonizing command decisions of the entire American war in Europe. Colonel Deschenaux, after conferring with Colonel Cavender and with his remaining battalion commanders, concluded that further resistance would serve no military purpose. His regiments were out of ammunition, out of food, out of medical supplies, out of time. Men were freezing to death in positions they couldn't heat. Wounded were dying from lack of medical care. The promised relief had not arrived and showed no signs of arriving. German loudspeakers were promising proper treatment of prisoners under Geneva Convention rules, and while Deschenaux didn't trust German promises entirely, he believed that surrender offered better chances of survival than continuing a hopeless defense. At 2:30 p.m. on December 19th, white flags began appearing along the American perimeter. German soldiers, many of them almost as shocked as their American counterparts that such a large force was surrendering, began accepting the surrender of approximately 7,000 American soldiers. It was the largest American capitulation in the European theatre since Kasserine Pass, and it meant that roughly 1/3 of the 106th Infantry Division had ceased to exist as a fighting force. But not everyone surrendered, and the story of those who refused orders and continued fighting adds a crucial coda to the Schnee Eifel disaster. Scattered across the pocket were small groups of soldiers who either never received the surrender order or who received it and chose to ignore it, or who decided that being captured wasn't acceptable regardless of what their commanders ordered. These men, perhaps 200 to 300 in total, slipped away from the surrendering formations and headed west through the forests, avoiding roads where German forces waited, trying to reach American lines that they hoped still existed somewhere beyond the German advance. Some were captured within hours, some died of exposure in the frozen forests, some were killed by German patrols. But approximately 150 American soldiers successfully evaded capture and eventually reached American lines, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks later, bringing with them stories of the disaster on the Schnee Eifel and testimony about what had gone wrong. Among these holdouts was Lieutenant Eric Wood, whose story would become legend, but that story belongs to a different chapter. For now, the Schnee Eifel had fallen, thousands of American soldiers were marching into captivity, and the Losheim Gap, already breached on December 16th, had now consumed 2 entire regiments that had done everything their commanders asked of them and had been destroyed anyway. December 19th, 1944, 2:45 in the afternoon, First Lieutenant Eric Wood stands at the edge of a clearing on the Schnee Eifel, watching his battalion commander raise a white flag above the command post. Wood is 24 years old, a former Rhodes Scholar finalist from Pennsylvania, an Eagle Scout who'd turned down graduate school to accept his commission. He's been fighting for 3 days with almost no sleep, has seen half his platoon killed or wounded, knows that his position is hopeless, and that surrender makes tactical sense. He understands all of this intellectually, but something in him, pride, stubbornness, or simply the refusal to accept that the story ends this way, makes him turn away from the white flag and walk into the forest. He's carrying his rifle, 2 bandoliers of ammunition, and no illusions about his chances. Behind him, 7,000 American soldiers are laying down their weapons. Ahead of him is winter forest, German patrols, and a personal war that will last until one of them kills him. The decision not to surrender was not one decision made by one man, but dozens of decisions made by scattered individuals across the collapsing pocket, each following their own logic or instinct. Some soldiers never received the surrender order because they were in forward positions cut off from communication. Some received it but were too far from German lines to safely approach without being shot. Some were wounded and knew that trying to walk to German positions would kill them faster than staying hidden. And some, like Lieutenant Wood, simply could not accept surrender as an option, could not imagine raising their hands and walking into captivity, could not reconcile their understanding of duty with the act of giving up. These men filtered into the forests in small groups, sometimes entire squads that stayed together, sometimes just pairs of soldiers who found each other, sometimes individuals moving alone. They had no unified plan, no coordination, no leadership structure. They were just American soldiers who'd decided that if they were going to die in Belgium, they'd die fighting rather than starving in a prisoner of war camp. The forests of the Ardennes in December offered both sanctuary and death to men trying to survive on their own. The dense pine woods provided cover from observation, with visibility limited to 50 yards or less in most places. Ravines and streambeds offered routes of movement that avoided roads where German patrols travelled. Abandoned farmhouses and barns provided temporary shelter from cold that dropped to 0 degrees Fahrenheit at night. But the same forest that hid American holdouts also concealed German units moving west, making every sound potentially hostile, every movement possibly an enemy patrol. The men who survived in these woods became nocturnal, moving at night when darkness concealed them, hiding during the day in whatever cover they could find. They ate what they could scavenge from abandoned positions, canned rations, frozen bread, anything that provided calories. They drank from streams, risking dysentery because dying from disease seemed preferable to dying from thirst. And they stayed alive through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer determination not to let the Germans win. Lieutenant Wood's personal war lasted longer than most and achieved more than anyone expected from a single officer with no support. In the first days after escaping the surrender, Wood gathered approximately 15 other soldiers, men from different units who'd also refused to give up, and organized them into something resembling a military unit. They established a base camp in a dense forest section near the village of Meyerode, rotating guard shifts, rationing the small amount of food they'd collected, and planning operations with the limited resources available to them. Wood, drawing on his training and his personality, he'd been described by fellow officers as methodical to the point of obsession, insisted on maintaining military discipline even though they had no supply line, no higher headquarters, no mission except survival. His men cleaned weapons daily, posted proper security, and followed Wood's orders as if they were still part of a formal military structure. This discipline, which might have seemed pointless given their situation, actually kept them alive by preventing the kind of panic decisions and sloppy practices that got other holdout groups captured or killed. The ambush on December 22nd revealed that Wood's group wasn't just surviving, they were actively fighting. A German supply convoy moving along a secondary road near Meyerode ran into a hastily prepared ambush. A felled tree blocking the road, rifle fire from both sides, grenades thrown at the disabled trucks. The convoy escort, perhaps a dozen German soldiers, returned fire briefly but then withdrew, abandoning 2 trucks and their contents. Wood's men, moving quickly before German reinforcements could arrive, stripped the trucks of everything useful: food, ammunition, weapons, winter clothing that German soldiers had been issued and American soldiers desperately needed. They found American prisoners being transported in one truck and freed them, sending them west with instructions on how to reach American lines. And they found documents in the cab of one truck, movement orders, supply manifests that provided intelligence about German logistics in the area. Wood kept these documents, planning to deliver them if he ever made it back to American lines. The ambush was risky, exposed their position, and could have gotten them all killed. But it also proved they could hurt the enemy, which mattered psychologically almost as much as the supplies they'd captured. What made Wood's operations significant beyond simple survival was that they interfered with German logistics at a moment when German logistics were already strained. The German offensive depended on capturing American fuel dumps and supply depots because German supply lines couldn't keep pace with the advance. Every truck destroyed, every convoy delayed, every supply dump the Germans couldn't use because American holdouts threatened it, contributed marginally to slowing the German advance. German after-action reports from this period, discovered decades later in archives, mention American partisan activity in the rear areas, specifically noting incidents near Meyerode and other locations where holdout groups operated. One report complained that a planned fuel dump consolidation had to be delayed because American irregulars made the route unsafe. These were tiny effects in the context of a massive battle, but they were effects nonetheless. Wood and his men weren't changing the outcome of the war, but they were making the Germans pay a price for their advance that was higher than it otherwise would have been. The incident that best illustrated the moral dimension of these holdout operations occurred on December 23rd in a farmhouse near My Road. Belgian civilians, a farmer, his wife, and their 3 children had been hiding in their cellar while the battle raged around their property. On the morning of the 23rd, an SS unit conducting anti-partisan operations discovered the family and accused them of harboring American soldiers. The accusation was false. The family had had no contact with Wood's group, but SS policy in these situations was summary execution. Wood's lookout observed SS soldiers herding the family out of the farmhouse and reported to Wood what was about to happen. Wood faced an impossible choice: intervene and risk his entire group being killed or captured, or do nothing and let civilians be murdered. He chose intervention. His group attacked the SS unit from concealment with the element of surprise, killing several SS soldiers and forcing the others to withdraw. The Belgian family survived. Wood's group had to abandon their base camp because the location was now compromised, forcing them to move deeper into the forest with winter closing in and their supplies running low. Every man in that group knew that saving those civilians had probably shortened their own survival time, and every man in that group later said they'd make the same choice again. The last confirmed sighting of Lieutenant Wood alive was in early January 1945 by a Belgian civilian who brought food to hidden American soldiers when she could. She described Wood as emaciated, suffering from frostbite in his feet, barely able to walk, but still armed and still refusing to surrender. His group had dwindled to perhaps 5 men, the others either killed, captured, or having died from exposure. Wood told the civilian that he planned to try reaching American lines, which by early January had moved back east as the Allied counteroffensive compressed the German salient. The civilian gave him what food she could spare and directions to where she thought American forces were. That was the last time anyone saw Eric Wood alive. His body was found in spring 1945 by American graves registration units in a foxhole near My Road, surrounded by evidence of a final stand. 23 expended ammunition magazines, German blood trails leading away from his position, and his identification tags still around his neck. The army initially listed him as missing in action, changed it to killed in action in 1949, and eventually awarded him the Silver Star and Distinguished Service Cross for his actions between December 19th and his death sometime in January. The broader story of American holdouts in the Ardennes forests included dozens of similar individual dramas, most less dramatic than Wood's, but equally illustrative of human determination. Some soldiers survived by attaching themselves to Belgian resistance networks, being hidden and fed by civilians who risked execution to help them. Some evaded by staying mobile, moving west continuously, staying ahead of German patrols, covering miles each night through frozen terrain. Some simply hid, finding caves or abandoned buildings and waiting for American forces to advance back through the area. The Army's official post-war history estimated that approximately 200 to 300 American soldiers avoided capture from the Schnee Eifel pocket, though exact numbers were impossible to determine because some holdouts were never found and some died without being identified. Their survival rate was low, perhaps 50%, eventually reached American lines, but the fact that any survived at all, operating without supply or support through the coldest December in decades, testified to human endurance under conditions that should have been unsurvivable. The legacy of these holdout operations extended far beyond their immediate military impact. For the Belgian civilians who witnessed them, the Americans who refused to surrender became symbols of resistance that helped them endure German reoccupation of their villages. For surviving American soldiers, the knowledge that some men had refused to accept defeat provided psychological comfort during the dark days of late December when the outcome of the battle was uncertain. And for post-war military analysis, the holdout operations provided case studies in evasion and resistance that influenced training and doctrine. But perhaps most importantly, the story of men like Eric Wood, men who had every reason to surrender and chose not to, who fought personal wars in frozen forests for reasons they probably couldn't fully articulate, reminded everyone who learned about them that military history isn't just about divisions and armies moving on maps. It's about individual human beings making choices in impossible circumstances, choices that define who they are more clearly than anything they did in peacetime. The Schnee Eifel had fallen, 7,000 men had been captured, but not everyone had surrendered. And in the forests of the Ardennes, ghosts in American uniforms continued fighting long after the official battle had moved elsewhere. December 16th, 1944, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper sits in the cupola of his command tank, stopped on a forest road 30 miles behind the German front line, and feels rage building in his chest like pressure in a boiler. The artillery barrage started at 5:30 this morning. His Kampfgruppe was supposed to begin its advance at 7. It's now 1400 hours, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and his column hasn't moved 50 meters because the roads are completely blocked by German infantry and horse-drawn wagons from the follow-on divisions. Piper is 29 years old, commands the lead battle group of the entire 6th Panzer Army, has been given the most important assignment of the offensive, and right now he's stuck behind a horse cart that's broken its wheel. He keys his radio and orders his lead tanks to push the cart off the road, physically push it with their tanks into the ditch, and to hell with proper traffic control. The offensive is 8.5 hours old, and Paper's spearhead hasn't even reached the jumping-off point yet. By the time they finally break through the traffic jam and cross the start line, they'll be 6 hours behind schedule. And Piper knows from his experience in Russia that in mobile warfare, 6 hours might as well be 6 days. Kampfgruppe Piper represented the German army's best remaining hope for reaching the Meuse River and achieving the breakthrough that the entire offensive required. Built around the 1st Battalion of Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler's 1st SS Panzer Regiment, the Kampfgruppe was a combined arms task force that included approximately 4,800 men organized into Panzer Grenadier, artillery, and engineer components. The tank component was particularly impressive: 72 Panthers, 30 King Tigers, and a company of Panzer IVs, enough armor to equip an entire Panzer Division earlier in the war. The King Tigers were especially formidable, mounting 88mm guns and armor so thick that most American anti-tank weapons couldn't penetrate them from any angle. Piper's orders were simple in concept and almost impossible in execution. Break through the American lines, advance 50 miles in 2 days, cross the Meuse River at Huy, turn northwest toward Antwerp. The route ran directly through the Losheim Gap, through villages where American units were dissolving under the initial German assault. On paper, the plan looked achievable. In practice, it required everything to go right, and in warfare, everything never goes right. Piper himself was exactly the kind of officer this mission required, and exactly the kind who would spend the rest of his life paying for what he did in war. He'd joined the SS at age 18, more from ideological conviction than from opportunism, and had risen through the ranks based on demonstrated competence in combat on the Eastern Front. He was personally brave, had been wounded twice, had earned the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, and was professionally skilled in the kind of mobile warfare that the German army practiced better than anyone else in the world. He was also ruthless in ways that blurred the line between military necessity and war crimes, though whether he personally ordered atrocities or simply failed to prevent subordinates from committing them would become the subject of post-war trials that never fully answered that question. His men respected him, some of them feared him, and all of them followed him because following Paper meant being part of the spearhead, being part of the unit that would either reach Antwerp or die trying. As his column finally broke free of the traffic jam and began rolling west at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Paper radioed his battalion commanders with a message that summarized both his personality and his mission. Fast, brutal, no stopping for anything. We drive until we reach the Meuse, or until we're dead. The breakthrough phase of Piper's advance, from late afternoon December 16th through the morning of December 17th, showed both the power of concentrated armor and the vulnerability of surprise defenders. As Piper's column rolled through the Losheim Gap, now essentially undefended after Colonel Devine's cavalry withdrawal, they encountered scattered American units that were retreating, disorganized, unaware that German armor was behind them. Near the village of Honsfeld, Piper's lead tanks overran an American supply dump and a company of engineer troops who were still sleeping when tanks began shooting up their billets. The Germans captured intact fuel supplies, approximately 50,000 gallons, that Paper's quartermaster immediately began pumping into German vehicles. They captured dozens of American trucks, which they pressed into service for their own supply column, and they captured approximately 200 American soldiers who were marched to the rear under guard. This was mobile warfare, as the Germans had perfected it in Poland, France, and Russia. Move fast, hit the enemy where they're not expecting you, capture their supplies before they can destroy them, keep moving before they can organize a response. But the massacre at Bonniers Crossroads, remembered by history as the Malmedy Massacre, though it actually occurred near the town of Malmedy rather than in it, revealed the dark side of Paper's advance and created a controversy that would outlive everyone involved. On December 17th, at approximately noon, Piper's column encountered Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion at a crossroads near Bonniers. The American unit, approximately 140 men in soft-skinned vehicles, was not equipped for combat and surrendered quickly when confronted by German tanks. German soldiers herded the American prisoners into a field adjacent to the crossroad while Paper's main column continued moving west. What happened next became one of the most controversial incidents of the war. German soldiers opened fire on the assembled prisoners with machine guns, killing 84 American soldiers. Approximately 43 prisoners escaped, some by feigning death, some by running into nearby woods. The survivors reached American lines and reported what had happened, and word of the massacre spread through Allied units faster than any official communication could have carried it. The impact on American soldier attitudes was immediate and lasting. For the rest of the campaign, SS prisoners were frequently shot rather than captured. German soldiers attempting to surrender were sometimes refused, and the battle became more vicious than it had been before news of Bonniers spread through American ranks. The question of Paper's personal responsibility for Bonniers would occupy war crimes tribunals for years, and historians still debate it today. Piper was not present at the crossroads when the massacre occurred. He was miles ahead with his late elements, but he commanded the Kampfgruppe, had set the tone for how prisoners would be treated through his emphasis on speed and ruthlessness. And under military law, commanders are responsible for their subordinates' actions. At his war crimes trial in 1946, Piper testified that he'd given no orders to kill prisoners, that the massacre violated his orders and military discipline, and that he only learned about it days later. Prosecutors argued that his overall guidance to his commanders, take no prisoners if they slow you down, amounted to an order for mass murder, even if he'd never explicitly said to shoot surrendered Americans. The tribunal convicted Paper and 42 other SS soldiers, sentencing Paper to death by hanging. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and he was eventually released in 1956 after serving 11 years. The legal controversy obscured a darker truth. Regardless of who gave what orders, German soldiers under Paper's command murdered 84 American prisoners in cold blood, and that action poisoned the entire campaign with a level of hatred that made the fighting more brutal for everyone involved. Piper's advance toward the Meuse continued through December 17th and 18th, with a speed that brought him closer to strategic success than any other German unit in the entire offensive. His column captured the town of Stavelot on December 17th, crossed the Amblève River, and pushed toward Trois-Ponts, where 3 bridges offered crossing points that would put him within striking distance of the Meuse. But at Trois-Ponts, American engineers managed to blow the bridge just as Paper's lead tanks approached, forcing him to detour north towards Stoumont. At Stoumont on December 18, his advance finally stalled completely. American reinforcements, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division and the 30th Infantry Division, had rushed forward and established defensive positions that even King Tiger tanks couldn't break through. American artillery, now coordinated and concentrated rather than scattered and surprised, began hammering Piper's column. And most crucially, the weather cleared on December 22nd, allowing Allied air power to engage for the first time. P-47, Thunderbolts and other fighter bombers attacked Paper's stretched-out column repeatedly, destroying tanks and trucks, cutting supply lines, making movement suicidal during daylight hours. By December 23, Piper's situation had reversed completely from spearhead to surrounded force. His Kampfgruppe was trapped in the village of La Glaise, approximately 5 miles short of the Meuse River that had been his objective. American forces held the roads around his position. His fuel was nearly exhausted. His vehicles were literally running on drops, with tank crews siphoning gas from disabled vehicles to keep a few tanks running. His ammunition was low, his casualties were mounting, and there was no prospect of relief because the entire German offensive had stalled short of its objectives. Paper radioed 6th Panzer Army headquarters requesting permission to break out on foot, abandoning his vehicles, attempting to reach German lines through American positions. The permission was granted because there was no alternative. On the night of December 23rd, Piper's surviving men, approximately 800 out of the original 4,800, slipped out of La Gliza in small groups, moving through frozen forests, trying to avoid American patrols. Some made it back to German lines, many were captured, many more died in the woods from cold or from American fire. Piper himself reached German lines on Christmas Day, having lost his entire Kampfgruppe, having come within 30 miles of changing the war's outcome, having failed. The wreckage of Kampfgruppe Piper's advance marked the high water mark of the German offensive through the Losheim Gap. Of the 100 tanks Piper began with, all 100 were lost, destroyed by American fire, abandoned when fuel ran out, or deliberately disabled when his troops withdrew from La Gliza. Of the 600 vehicles, none returned to German lines. Of the 4,800 men, fewer than 1,000 made it back, and many of those were wounded. The supplies captured at Honsfeld had enabled Piper to advance farther than he otherwise could have, but the failure to capture additional American fuel dumps meant he couldn't sustain the advance. And the massacre at Bonnières, whatever its immediate tactical irrelevance, had created a psychological impact that stiffened American resistance and probably contributed to the ferocity with which American units fought to stop him. Piper had done everything that could have been asked of him. Tactically, he'd achieved surprise, exploited the gap, driven deeper than any other German commander. But tactical excellence couldn't overcome strategic impossibility, operational failure to support the advance, and simple mathematics that there weren't enough German soldiers or enough German fuel to reach Antwerp, regardless of how well individual commanders performed. The legend and the reality of Kampfgruppe Piper would become thoroughly tangled in post-war memory. To German veterans, Piper became a symbol of military professionalism, the soldier who'd nearly achieved the impossible through skill and determination. To Allied veterans, he became the war criminal responsible for Malmedy, the SS killer who'd murdered prisoners and gotten away with it. Both versions contained elements of truth and elements of myth-making. The real Piper was more complex, a talented officer who'd been raised in a criminal organization, a skilled tactician who served a genocidal regime, a brave soldier who commanded men who committed atrocities. After his release from prison in 1956, he lived quietly in various locations, eventually settling in France under an assumed name. In 1976, his identity was discovered by Nazi hunters, and shortly thereafter, his house was firebombed, killing him. Whether his death was revenge for Malmedy, political assassination, or something else was never definitively determined. But the violent end seemed fitting for a man whose military career had been defined by violence, whose greatest achievement was a failed offensive through a gap that briefly opened and then closed, leaving thousands dead and changing nothing about the war's inevitable outcome. The Losheim Gap had allowed Piper to advance farther than he should have been able to, but it couldn't give him victory, and in the end, the gap that had opened on December 16th closed around him like a trap, consuming his Kampfgruppe and sending him fleeing back through the same forests he'd driven through in triumph just days before. December 17th, 1944, 6 o'clock in the evening, Brigadier General Bruce Clark stands in the ruins of what had been St. Vith Town Square, watching his tanks roll through streets, still smoking from German artillery fire, and tries to understand how a situation that was supposed to be stabilizing looks like the end of the world. Clark commands Combat Command B of the 7th Armoured Division, approximately 4,000 men with tanks and mobile artillery, and he's been ordered to reach St. Vith and restore the situation. He'd expected to find an organised defensive position that needed reinforcement. Instead, he's finding chaos. Retreating American infantry with no organisation, abandoned equipment blocking roads, Belgian civilians fleeing west with everything they can carry, and officers who can't tell him where German forces are because they don't know. A major from the 106th Division approaches Clark's command vehicle and delivers the message that summarises everything. General, thank God you're here. Can you tell us what's happening? We've lost contact with everyone. Clark realises with sinking certainty that he hasn't arrived to reinforce a defence. He's arrived to create one from scratch. St. Vith was a modest Belgian town of approximately 3,000 inhabitants that had no particular strategic importance, except for the fact that 5 major roads and a railway line converged there. In military terminology, it was a communications centre, a place that controlled movement rather than production or population. In the flat, forested terrain of the Ardennes, where good roads were scarce and where armoured divisions needed trafficable routes to advance, St. Vith represented a bottleneck. Whoever held St. Vith controlled movement through the entire central Ardennes. The Germans needed it to support their advance toward the Meuse, to move supplies forward, to shift forces between their northern and southern attacks. The Americans needed to deny it to the Germans for exactly the same reasons. And in December 1944, St. Vith sat directly behind the Losheim Gap, making it the first major town German forces would reach after breaking through American lines. Its capture had been scheduled in German planning for the afternoon of December 17th. That it would hold until December 21st represented one of the greatest American defensive stands of the war, achieved largely because nobody told the defenders that their situation was hopeless. The defense of St. Vith crystallized around a decision General Clark made within hours of arriving. Instead of trying to hold just the town itself, he'd establish a horseshoe-shaped defensive perimeter around it, incorporating the hills and ridges that dominated approaches from the east and south. This meant spreading his force thin, 4,000 men defending a perimeter approximately 15 miles long, but it gave American units defensible terrain and fields of fire, rather than fighting inside a town where German armor would have overwhelming advantages. Clark organized the defense with whatever units were available: his own armored infantry and tanks, remnants of the 106th Division that had retreated to St. Vith, engineer battalions pressed into service as infantry, artillery units firing over open sights because forward observers were dead or captured. It was an improvised defense built from broken pieces, but Clark gave it structure and leadership, which mattered more than anyone realized at the time. American soldiers who'd been retreating in disorder suddenly had positions to defend, orders to follow, a general who seemed to know what he was doing even though the situation was desperate. The German assault on St. Vith began in earnest on December 18th and revealed immediately that the Americans intended to make this costly. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division, attacking from the east, ran into prepared American positions on the ridges outside town and discovered that what they'd been told would be a broken, demoralized enemy was actually a coherent defensive line with artillery support and armor reserves. The attack stalled, the Germans regrouped, brought up more artillery, attacked again. The Americans held. By the end of December 18th, the Germans had gained perhaps a mile of ground at the cost of hundreds of casualties, and St. Vith was still firmly in American hands. Field Marshal Model, watching red pins on his situation map fail to advance as planned, realized that the entire 5th Panzer Army's northern thrust was being constrained by American resistance at St. Vith. The town had to be taken, and taken quickly, or the entire offensive timetable would collapse. He ordered the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division to join the assault from the south, effectively committing 2 entire divisions, approximately 30,000 men, to capturing a town defended by 4,000. December 19th brought the heaviest fighting of the entire St. Vith battle, with German forces attacking simultaneously from 3 directions and achieving small penetrations that threatened to collapse the entire position. American units found themselves fighting isolated battles, cut off from adjacent units, reduced to radioing for artillery fire on their own positions when German infantry overran them. A platoon of tank destroyers from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion found itself defending a critical crossroads against German armor at odds of roughly 10-1, and held the position for 6 hours through a combination of good gunnery and sheer stubbornness. An engineer company that had been building bridges 3 days earlier was now fighting as infantry in trenches they'd dug with their own equipment, holding a section of perimeter against repeated German attacks. And everywhere, American artillery, operating from positions in and around St. Vith, fired continuously, breaking up German assault formations, disrupting attacks before they could develop momentum. The artillery consumed ammunition at rates that exceeded supply capacity, with artillery battalions firing 5 times their normal daily ammunition allocation. Battery commanders stopped asking permission to fire missions and simply fired at anything German within range, trusting that resupply would arrive somehow, or that they'd run out of ammunition at the same moment they ran out of Germans to shoot at. The decision to evacuate St. Vith came not from General Clark, but from Corps headquarters, which finally recognized on December 21st that holding the town was preventing Clark's force from being used where it was needed more desperately. The defense had succeeded brilliantly. St. Vith had held for 6 days when German planning had allocated 36 hours for its capture. But the German noose was tightening, with German forces now west of St. Vith threatening to cut off the defenders entirely. General Middleton at 8 Corps headquarters gave Clark permission to withdraw, leaving behind a town that was no longer defensible and preserving a force that could fight elsewhere. The withdrawal began on the night of December 21st under cover of darkness, with American units pulling back through a narrow corridor that German forces hadn't yet closed. It was a risky maneuver, withdrawing under pressure, with the enemy on three sides, and it required discipline and coordination that barely existed after days of continuous fighting. But Clark managed it, getting most of his command out of the pocket, though rearguard units fought desperate holding actions to keep escape routes open long enough for the main body to pass through. The cost of defending St. Vith hit hardest when units tallied casualties after the evacuation. Clark's Combat Command B, which had arrived with 4,000 men, came out with approximately 2,500 effectives, a 37% casualty rate in 5 days. The remnants of 106th Division units that had fought at St. Vith had been reduced to skeleton formations, with some infantry companies down to fewer than 20 men. Tank battalions had lost more than half their tanks, some to German fire, some abandoned when they ran out of fuel or through tracks and couldn't be recovered. Artillery battalions had lost most of their guns, either destroyed by counter-battery fire or abandoned when positions became untenable. Medical units had exhausted their supplies and were treating wounded with improvised materials. And the toll on Belgian civilians caught between the defenders and attackers, subjected to days of artillery fire and street fighting, was never accurately counted but certainly ran into the hundreds. The town itself was a ruin, with whole blocks burned to foundations and streets impassable with rubble. When German forces finally entered St. Vith on December 22nd, they found a smoking wreck that would require extensive engineer work before it could function as the logistics hub they'd expected to use. Yet the defence of St. Vith achieved something that no amount of casualties could diminish. It bought time for the Allied defensive line to coalesce behind it. Every day that St. Vith held was a day that German forces couldn't advance to the next set of objectives, couldn't bring supplies forward efficiently, couldn't shift units between sectors. Field Marshal von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, later wrote that the delay at St. Vith cost us the entire offensive schedule and possibly the whole operation. By December 21st, when St. Vith finally fell, American reinforcements were moving into position across the entire Ardennes sector, establishing defensive lines that the Germans would never break through. The 7th Armoured Division's stand had been a tactical withdrawal in the end, but it was also a strategic victory because it achieved the essential purpose of defensive warfare, trading space for time, making the enemy pay a price that exceeded the value of the ground they gained. The men who fought at St. Vith didn't know they'd accomplished this. Most of them thought they'd failed because they'd retreated. But historians analysing the battle in the years that followed would recognise that Clark's improvised defence at a crossroads town nobody had heard of before. December 1944 was one of the key actions that prevented the German offensive from achieving its objectives. The aftermath of St. Vith's fall left German forces holding a ruined town that they'd expected to be using for logistics operations, but that instead required reconstruction before it could serve any useful purpose. The roads through St. Vith, which German planners had expected to be funneling supplies and reinforcements to their spearhead units, were blocked with rubble and destroyed vehicles. The rail line, which should have been transporting heavy equipment, had been thoroughly demolished by American engineers before the evacuation. The buildings that could have sheltered German troops were burned out shells. And most importantly, the 5 days spent capturing St. Vith had disrupted the entire German timetable so thoroughly that units following the assault divisions found themselves arriving days behind schedule, creating logistics bottlenecks that planners had specifically tried to avoid. When post-war analysts calculated which American actions had been most effective in defeating the German offensive, the defense of St. Vith ranked near the top of the list, not because it inflicted massive German casualties, though it did, but because it disrupted German operational plans at the exact moment when those plans were most vulnerable. The Losheim Gap had opened on December 16th. St. Vith's defence prevented the Germans from fully exploiting that opening, and by the time St. Vith fell on December 22nd, the strategic opportunity the gap had represented was already closing. Sometimes in warfare, the most important victories are the ones that give your side time to recover from initial defeats. St. Vith was that kind of victory, even though it ended with retreat and flames and German soldiers walking through rubble singing victory songs that history would prove were premature. January 15th, 1945, 10 o'clock in the morning, Colonel Mark Devine sits before an army investigation board in a commandeered hotel in Luxembourg City, watching 3 senior officers review documents that will probably end his career. The board is investigating his actions during the first days of the German offensive, specifically his decision to withdraw the 14th Cavalry Group from its forward positions in the Losheim Gap on December 16th and 17th. Devine is an experienced officer, 43 years old, West Point class of 23, with a pre-war career that showed promise and wartime service that had been solid if unspectacular. Everything he'd done in 21 years of service has led to this moment. Sitting in a hotel conference room, defending decisions he made in the chaos of combat, trying to convince officers who weren't there that he'd done the right thing, knowing that, whether they believe him or not, his reputation is already destroyed. The question before the board isn't really whether Devine made the correct tactical decision. The question is whether someone has to be blamed for the disaster at the Losheim Gap, and Devine is the most convenient target. The specific actions under investigation centered on Devine's withdrawal orders given on December 16th and 17th, and the board's mandate was to determine whether those withdrawals were militarily justified or whether they represented failure to execute assigned missions. The timeline was damning on its face. Devine's Cavalry Group was assigned to defend the Losheim Gap. The German offensive began on December 16th. By December 17th, the 14th Cavalry Group had withdrawn from its forward positions, in some cases without orders from higher headquarters, opening the gap to German exploitation. This sequence of events, assignment, attack, withdrawal, looked like failure regardless of the tactical details. And in the aftermath of a battle that had nearly become an Allied disaster, where thousands of American soldiers had been killed or captured, where German forces had advanced 50 miles into Allied-held territory, the army needed to understand what had gone wrong. If officers had failed in their duties, those failures needed to be identified and appropriate action taken. The board's investigation of Devine was part of this larger accountability process, and the fact that it was happening at all suggested someone at higher headquarters had already concluded that accountability was required. The testimony Devine provided to the board outlined the situation his cavalry group had faced, and the numbers alone suggested how impossible his mission had been. The 14th Cavalry Group consisted of approximately 900 men, organised into 2 squadrons plus supporting units. Standard doctrine said a cavalry group could effectively screen 3 miles of front in fluid situations, perhaps 5 miles if terrain was good and the enemy wasn't aggressive. Devine had been assigned 9 miles of front in mountainous, forested terrain against an enemy who turned out to be launching a major offensive with 3 divisions, approximately 60,000 men. The disparity between mission and resources was roughly 65-1 in terms of manpower. Devine's testimony emphasized this point repeatedly. His group was never meant to fight a major battle, was never resourced to hold against serious attack, was explicitly structured to provide early warning and then withdraw to more defensible positions where mainline units would conduct the actual defense. When the German attack came, his unit had done exactly what cavalry doctrine said it should do. Screen, report enemy contact, delay as long as possible, withdraw when being overrun, preserve the force to screen again somewhere else. That this doctrinally correct action had resulted in the Losheim Gap being breached wasn't his failure, it was the inevitable result of assigning a screening force to defend terrain as if they were a full-strength infantry division. The board's questioning revealed the real issue, not whether Devine had made a military error, but whether his withdrawal had enabled the larger disaster that followed. The lead investigator, a brigadier general from 1st Army Staff, posed the question directly. Colonel, do you acknowledge that your withdrawal from Losheim allowed German forces to penetrate through the gap without opposition? Devine's answer was careful. Yes, sir. German forces moved through the area my group had been screening, but had my group remained in position, German forces would have destroyed it and then moved through the gap anyway. The only difference would have been that we'd have lost 900 cavalrymen without delaying the German advance significantly. This was the core of Devine's defence. His withdrawal hadn't changed the outcome, it had just prevented his unit from being annihilated uselessly. But the investigator pressed further, did you request permission from division headquarters before withdrawing? And here, Devine had to admit that on December 16th, when communication with division headquarters was impossible due to cut telephone lines and jammed radio networks, he'd made the withdrawal decision on his own authority. In military terms, this was technically a violation of command protocol. In practical terms, it was what any field commander would have done when facing imminent destruction and unable to get orders from higher headquarters. But technically correct and practically necessary, can both be true while an officer still faces career-ending censure. The investigation board's interim findings, delivered in February 1945, were carefully worded to avoid explicitly condemning Devine while making clear that someone above the board wanted him removed from command. The report stated that Devine's withdrawals were militarily understandable given the overwhelming force applied against his positions, but that they may have been premature in some instances and that better communication with higher headquarters might have resulted in more coordinated defensive actions. The key phrase was may have been premature, not were premature, but may have been, leaving open the possibility that Devine was guilty of something without explicitly stating what. The practical outcome was inevitable. Devine was relieved of command in February 1945, reduced from his wartime temporary rank of brigadier general to his permanent rank of colonel, and transferred to a staff position where he'd finished the war processing paperwork rather than commanding troops. He was never formally court-martialed, never officially found guilty of anything, but also never cleared or exonerated. His military career, for all practical purposes, ended in a Luxembourg hotel room where 3 generals who hadn't been at Losheim on December 16th decided that his decisions there required consequences. The controversy surrounding Devine's relief extended far beyond his personal career and raised fundamental questions about command responsibility under impossible circumstances. Other officers who'd been present during the Losheim Gap battle, particularly those who'd fought under Devine's command, provided testimony supporting his decisions. A squadron commander testified that Devine's withdrawal orders had probably saved most of the cavalry group from destruction or capture. A battalion commander from the 106th Division testified that the cavalry group's delaying action, even though brief, had given his unit crucial time to prepare defensive positions. Even General Middleton, who commanded 8 Corps and whose operational decisions had put the cavalry group in that impossible position, provided testimony suggesting Devine had made reasonable choices given his circumstances. But none of this testimony prevented Devine's relief, suggesting that the investigation was less about determining facts than about finding someone to blame, and Devine was the most convenient scapegoat. Decades after the war, captured German documents provided an ironic coda to the Devine controversy. 5th Panzer Army's operational planning documents, discovered in archives in the 1990s, showed that German intelligence had specifically identified the 14th Cavalry Group's positions as the weak point in American defences and had planned to encircle and destroy the entire unit on December 16th. The German plan anticipated that the Cavalry Group would try to hold its positions, allowing German forces to surround it, forcing its surrender or destruction, and eliminating it as a fighting force. Devine's premature withdrawal had actually prevented the Germans from achieving one of their specific tactical objectives. Had the cavalry group stayed in position, as the investigation board seemed to think it should have, the unit would have been destroyed, its men killed or captured, achieving nothing except adding to casualty lists. The German documents essentially vindicated Devine's tactical judgment. He'd saved his command by withdrawing when destruction was imminent, and his withdrawal had disrupted German plans that depended on destroying his unit in place. But this vindication came too late to restore Devine's career or reputation. The broader issue that Devine's case highlighted was how the American military dealt with defeats, particularly unexpected defeats that challenged institutional assumptions. The army in December 1944 believed it was winning the war, believed the Germans were beaten, believed that major German offensives were impossible. When the Losheim Gap breakthrough proved all these beliefs wrong, the institutional response wasn't to question the beliefs, but to find individuals who'd failed to prevent the facts from contradicting the beliefs. Devine was one of several officers whose careers were damaged or destroyed, not necessarily because they'd made wrong decisions, but because they'd been present when something went wrong and someone needed to be held accountable. The impulse toward accountability is important in military organizations. Commanders must be responsible for their decisions and their unit's actions. But accountability becomes problematic when it's applied retroactively based on outcomes rather than on whether decisions were reasonable given what commanders knew at the time. Devine made a decision on December 16th to withdraw rather than be destroyed, based on what he knew about enemy strength and his own unit's capabilities. That decision looked wrong to investigators reviewing the battle a month later, because they knew the decision had resulted in the Losheim Gap being breached. But Devine didn't have the benefit of hindsight when he made it, and judging commanders by outcomes they couldn't have predicted creates a system where officers are punished for being unlucky rather than for being incompetent. The final assessment of Devine's actions came not from official investigations but from military historians who studied the battle in detail decades later. The Army Historical Division's official history of the Ardennes campaign, published in 1965, concluded that Devine's withdrawals were militarily sound given circumstances at the time, and that criticism of Colonel Devine's actions appears to have been based more on the need to assign responsibility for the breakthrough than on fair assessment of his decisions. This was as close as the army ever came to officially exonerating Devine, and it came 20 years too late to restore his career. Devine retired from the army in 1946, worked in civilian life, and died in 1977, never having received formal recognition that his decisions in December 1944 had been correct. His case became a cautionary tale studied at military academies. How institutional needs for accountability can result in individual injustice, how commanders can make right decisions and still be punished for them, and how the fog of war extends beyond the battlefield into the investigations and assessments that follow battles. The Losheim Gap was breached not because Mark Devine failed in his duty, but because he was given an impossible mission with inadequate resources. That he managed to save most of his command under those circumstances should have been recognised as success. That it wasn't recognised as such tells us more about how organisations deal with unexpected failure than it does about Devine's competence as a commander. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought against the enemy, they're fought against your own side's need to explain why things went wrong. And in that battle, Devine was always going to lose. December 17th, 1944, 9 o'clock in the morning. Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower sits in his office at the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles, reading intelligence summaries that arrived overnight, and realizes with uncomfortable clarity that his armies are facing something far more serious than the local spoiling attack his staff described yesterday. The German offensive that began 30 hours ago is not a limited operation designed to disrupt Allied preparations. It's a major counteroffensive involving multiple panzer armies, pushing west through a 40-mile front in the Ardennes. Eisenhower's strategic instincts, honed through years of balancing coalition politics with military necessity, tell him something his subordinates haven't grasped yet. This isn't a crisis, it's an opportunity. The Germans have left their defensive positions, have committed their mobile reserves to an offensive, have concentrated their strength in a place where Allied air power can reach them once weather clears. If the Allies respond correctly, this German gamble could shorten the war by months. If they respond incorrectly or too slowly, it could become a catastrophe that destroys the entire Allied strategic position in Northwest Europe. Eisenhower picks up his telephone and begins issuing orders that will move 250,000 men toward the Ardennes in the next 72 hours. The initial Allied response to the German offensive revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of coalition warfare under Eisenhower's command structure. The strength was flexibility. Eisenhower commanded armies from multiple nations and could shift forces between sectors based on operational needs rather than political considerations. The weakness was complexity. Every major decision involved coordinating between American, British, and Allied headquarters, each with their own chains of command, communication systems, and operational procedures. The German breakthrough forced Eisenhower to exercise command authority he'd carefully avoided using before, making unilateral decisions that would have repercussions for months. His first critical decision came on December 17th, when he ordered strategic reserves, the 18th Airborne Corps, including both the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, to move immediately to the Ardennes, without waiting for detailed intelligence about where exactly they were needed. This was military improvisation at the highest level, committing 30,000 elite troops to a sector before knowing precisely where to commit them, trusting that by the time they arrived, someone would have figured out where they needed to fight. The meeting at Verdun on December 19th became the moment when Allied response transitioned from reactive scrambling to coordinated counteroffensive planning. Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders, Bradley, Patton, Devers, in the French city that had been the scene of horrific slaughter in World War I, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The room was cold because fuel shortages limited heating, forcing generals to keep their coats on. The atmosphere was tense because the situation was still developing and nobody had complete information. But Eisenhower set the tone immediately by asking, not how do we stop this, but when can we counterattack? The difference in framing was crucial. Instead of treating the German offensive as a problem to be solved defensively, Eisenhower treated it as an opportunity to be exploited offensively. His logic was straightforward. If German forces had extended themselves into a salient, that salient had flanks that could be attacked. And if those flanks could be cut, German forces inside the salient would be trapped and destroyed. The question wasn't whether to counterattack, but when. Patton's response to Eisenhower's question became one of the most famous moments of the entire war, though the reality was more complex than the legend suggests. When Eisenhower asked when Third Army could attack north into the German salient's southern flank, Patton answered, 48 hours. The other commanders in the room reacted with disbelief, turning an entire army 90 degrees from its current axis of attack, moving it 75 miles north, and launching a coordinated offensive in 2 days was conventionally considered impossible. But Patton had anticipated this moment, had already directed his staff to prepare contingency plans for exactly this scenario, and had units beginning movement before the Verdun meeting even concluded. The 48 hours answer was part showmanship. Patton knew it would impress Eisenhower, and part genuine capability, reflecting Third Army's organizational effectiveness and Patton's own aggressive command style. In practice, the attack took 72 hours rather than 48, but even 72 hours represented a logistics and operational feat that German planners had thought impossible, which was why they'd positioned minimal forces to defend against this exact contingency. The decision to place Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in command of all Allied forces north of the German penetration was militarily logical but politically explosive, and the controversy it generated lasted long after the battle ended. By December 20th, the German salient had cut communications between Bradley's headquarters and the American forces fighting north of the Bulge, the 1st and 9th Armies. Bradley couldn't effectively command units he couldn't communicate with, but Montgomery's headquarters had functioning communication links with those same units. Eisenhower's decision to temporarily transfer them to Montgomery's command was operationally sound. It created unified command north of the breakthrough, enabled faster decision-making, and allowed resources to be shifted more efficiently. But it was also a public relations nightmare because it appeared to suggest that American commanders had failed and needed British rescue, which fed into existing tensions between American and British leadership. Bradley was furious at what he considered a vote of no confidence. Patton threatened to resign. American press coverage suggested British forces were saving incompetent Americans. The entire episode illustrated how coalition warfare requires balancing military effectiveness against political sustainability, and sometimes those requirements are contradictory. The most consequential Allied response wasn't troop movements or command changes, but the weather finally clearing on December 22nd, allowing Allied air power to engage in strength for the first time since the offensive began. The German plan had explicitly depended on bad weather grounding Allied aircraft, giving German forces several days to advance before having to face air attack. For the first 5 days of the offensive, this assumption proved correct. Low clouds, fog, and occasional snow kept most Allied aircraft on the ground. But on the morning of December 22nd, weather across northwest Europe suddenly cleared, and what had been a ground battle became an integrated air-ground campaign that the Germans had no capability to match. In the single day of December 23rd, Allied aircraft flew more than 5,000 sorties over the Ardennes, fighter bombers attacking German columns, medium bombers hitting supply concentrations, reconnaissance aircraft photographing German positions. The Luftwaffe managed approximately 700 sorties in response, a 7-to-1 disparity that meant German forces moved only at night and suffered devastating attacks whenever they tried to maneuver during daylight. The psychological impact on German soldiers was enormous. They'd been told the Luftwaffe would protect them, had been promised that Allied air superiority was a myth. Instead, they spent the daylight hours hiding in forests, while American P-47s destroyed their tanks and trucks with impunity. The aerial assault's effectiveness went beyond simple destruction of vehicles and equipment. It disrupted the entire German operational rhythm and logistic structure. German planning had assumed they could move supplies forward during the day, reposition forces in daylight, conduct reconnaissance flights to locate American defensive positions. Allied air superiority made all of this impossible. Supply convoys had to move at night, reducing the daily tonnage delivered to forward units by more than half. Troop movements took twice as long because columns had to disperse into forests whenever aircraft were heard. Reconnaissance became suicidal, forcing German commanders to make decisions based on outdated intelligence or guesswork, and, perhaps most importantly, the constant air attacks destroyed German morale by demonstrating that the promises they'd been given about Luftwaffe support were lies. Post-war interrogations of German prisoners revealed that air attacks were mentioned more frequently than any other factor as the reason they'd lost faith in achieving the offensive's objectives. You can order men to advance in the face of artillery fire, can demand they assault prepared positions, can require heroism and sacrifice, but you cannot order men to maintain offensive spirit when they're being bombed continuously by an enemy who operates with complete impunity while their own air force is nowhere to be seen. The logistics effort supporting Allied response was as impressive as the combat operations and far less recognised in popular accounts of the battle. Moving 250,000 men to the Ardennes in December required transporting them on roads that were icy, through weather that was the worst in decades, past traffic jams created by retreating units and fleeing civilians. It required finding fuel for thousands of vehicles when fuel supplies were already constrained by the distance from port facilities to the front. It required ammunition, food, medical supplies, winter clothing, all of which had to be redirected from other sectors and delivered to units that were often moving while supplies were being transported. The Red Ball Express truck units, staffed largely by African American soldiers who faced discrimination in every aspect of military life except the demand for their labour, drove 24-hour shifts to keep supplies moving. Railroad units repaired tracks that German artillery had damaged, restored destroyed bridges, got trains running through sectors where fighting was still ongoing. Quartermaster units established supply dumps in forward areas while fighting continued around them. None of this made headlines, none of it generated dramatic photographs, but without it, the combat units that stopped the German offensive would have been immobilized for lack of fuel, unable to fight for lack of ammunition, and unable to survive the December cold for lack of winter equipment. By December 26th, just 10 days after the German offensive began, the Allied response had fundamentally altered the strategic situation. Patton's Third Army had broken through to relieve Bastogne, collapsing the southern shoulder of the German salient. Montgomery's forces had stabilized the northern shoulder and were preparing counterattacks. American air power was systematically destroying German supply lines, preventing forward units from being resupplied or reinforced, and German forces that had advanced 50 miles into Belgium were now spread across a bulge that was becoming a trap rather than a breakthrough. The shift from defensive crisis to offensive opportunity had taken less than 2 weeks, and it demonstrated both the flexibility of Allied command structures and the depth of Allied resources. The Germans had gambled that they could achieve breakthrough before the Allies could respond effectively. They'd achieved tactical surprise and initial success. But operational and strategic surprise requires not just catching your enemy off guard, but also preventing them from recovering. And the Allied response showed that recovery was possible if you had sufficient reserves, sufficient mobility, and sufficient organizational capacity to shift forces faster than the enemy could exploit initial gains. The human cost of this rapid response was easy to forget amid the celebration of operational success. Soldiers who'd been training for different missions were thrown into combat with minimal preparation. Units that had been in rest areas were rushed forward without proper intelligence about what they'd be fighting. Airborne divisions jumped into defensive positions without the heavy equipment they normally relied on. Tank crews fought in cold so severe that engine oil froze and weapons malfunctioned. Infantry dug foxholes in frozen ground, often without proper winter equipment, suffering frostbite casualties that sometimes exceeded combat casualties. And everywhere, exhaustion became as much an enemy as German soldiers. Men fighting on 3 hours of sleep per night, officers making life or death decisions while so tired they could barely think, medics treating wounded while dealing with their own cold injuries. The Allied response succeeded, but it succeeded because thousands of individual soldiers performed beyond what should have been physically possible, because officers demanded effort that exceeded human limits, because the entire organizational structure operated at unsustainable intensity for weeks. You cannot maintain that intensity indefinitely, but you can maintain it long enough to win a specific battle, and that's what the Allied response to the Losheim Gap breakthrough demonstrated. The Germans had opened the gap, the Allies had closed it, and in the process, they'd created conditions for a counteroffensive that would consume what remained of German mobile reserves and leave Germany defenseless when the final Allied offensives began in spring. December 19th, 1944, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Private First Class William Shapiro stands in a muddy field near the Schnee Eifel with his hands raised above his head, watching German soldiers separate prisoners into groups, and tries to understand what criteria they're using. Shapiro's 22 years old, from Brooklyn, has been in combat for exactly 3 days before his regiment surrendered this morning. Around him are approximately 7,000 other American soldiers, cold, hungry, confused, and frightened about what comes next. A German officer walks through the prisoners, looking at faces, occasionally stopping to ask questions, checking identification tags. When the officer reaches Shapiro, he looks at his tags, sees the letter H for Hebrew, and gestures to a different group forming on the left side of the field. Shapiro doesn't understand why he's being separated until he looks at the other prisoners being directed to that group and realizes they're all Jewish. The German officer doesn't explain. He just points, and Shapiro, knowing that argument will accomplish nothing except getting himself shot, walks to where he's directed and tries not to think about what being separated might mean. The forced march from the Schnee Eifel to German rail transport points began within hours of the surrender and revealed immediately that German treatment of prisoners would vary wildly depending on which units captured them and which officers were in charge. Some American prisoners were treated reasonably, according to Geneva Convention standards, disarmed, organized into columns, marched toward the rear with occasional rest stops and minimal food provided. Others were treated with casual brutality, beaten for moving too slowly, shot for trying to help wounded comrades, left without food or medical care. The variations seemed random to prisoners who couldn't distinguish between different German units, but it actually reflected a pattern. Wehrmacht regular army units generally followed military protocol, while SS units and some Volksgrenadier units treated prisoners as they'd learned to treat prisoners on the Eastern Front, which meant that prisoner rights were suggestions rather than requirements. The march itself covered approximately 80 miles over 7 days, in temperatures that dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit at night, with prisoners wearing summer uniforms because winter equipment hadn't been issued before the offensive began. Men who'd been wounded in the fighting before surrender often couldn't keep pace and were left behind, sometimes with German medics, sometimes simply left by the roadside to freeze. Prisoners estimated that approximately 200 men died or were killed during the march, though exact numbers were never determined because the chaos prevented accurate record-keeping. The conditions in the boxcars that transported prisoners from Belgium into Germany represented a level of suffering that even veteran combat soldiers found almost unendurable. German transport officers packed approximately 60 prisoners into each 40 and 8 boxcar, so called because they were designed to carry 40 men or 8 horses. 60 men in a space designed for 40 meant prisoners couldn't sit simultaneously, couldn't lie down, could barely move. The cars had no heat, no toilet facilities, no ventilation except for small barred openings near the roof. The journey to Stalag 9B at Bad Orb took 3 days, during which prisoners received no food and minimal water. Men urinated and defecated where they stood because there was nowhere else. Wounded men who'd survived the march died in the boxcars from untreated injuries or simply from exposure and exhaustion. Private Harold Goldstein from Massachusetts later described the boxcar journey. I'd been in combat, had been shelled and shot at, had watched friends die, but nothing in combat was as bad as those 3 days in that boxcar. In combat, you can fight back. You have some control. In that boxcar, you just had to endure, and every hour I wondered if I'd survive another hour. When the doors finally opened and we stumbled out, men were lying dead on the floor and the rest of us could barely walk. Stalag IXB at Bad Orb was designed to hold 4,000 prisoners and was already holding approximately 7,000 when the Schnee Eifel prisoners arrived, bringing the population to more than 9,000. The camp consisted of wooden barracks that had been built for a smaller population, a perimeter fence, guard towers, and administrative buildings. There were insufficient bunks, forcing prisoners to sleep in shifts or on bare floors. Toilet facilities were overwhelmed, creating sanitation conditions that would have violated every health regulation in existence if anyone had been enforcing regulations. Food rations were 600 calories per day, approximately 1/3 of what a sedentary person needs and perhaps 1/5 of what men recovering from combat and march stress required. The ration typically consisted of thin soup made from turnips or potatoes, occasionally supplemented with small amounts of bread or ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Men lost weight rapidly, 15 to 20 pounds in the first month was typical. Diseases spread through the overcrowded barracks. Dysentery, pneumonia, trench foot from standing in cold and wet conditions. The camp hospital had minimal medical supplies and couldn't treat most conditions beyond providing warm places for the sickest prisoners to rest. Germans' guards, themselves poorly supplied as Germany's logistics system collapsed, couldn't or wouldn't provide additional resources. The camp commandant, when confronted by American medical officers about conditions, reportedly responded that Germany was losing the war and conditions everywhere in Germany were terrible, so prisoners should consider themselves fortunate to be alive at all. The separation of Jewish American prisoners from the general POW population began in late January 1945 and represented one of the most disturbing aspects of the Schnee Eifel prisoners' captivity. German authorities, acting on orders from higher command, identified approximately 350 Jewish American prisoners at Stalag 9B using identification tags, personnel records, and physical inspections that prisoners found humiliating and terrifying. These prisoners were told they were being transferred to a work camp where conditions would be better. Instead, they were transported to Bulge and Der Elster, a slave labor camp where prisoners were forced to dig tunnels for underground factories that would be immune to Allied bombing. The work was brutal, 12-hour shifts, digging through rock with inadequate tools, minimal food, and beatings for prisoners who worked too slowly. Guards at Bulge were selected from among the most brutal personnel available, with many having served in concentration camps and bringing those methods to Bulge. The death rate among prisoners at Bulge was approximately 20% in 3 months, 73 American soldiers dying from overwork, starvation, beating, or simple exhaustion. This was far higher than death rates at standard POW camps and approached death rates in concentration camps, making Bulge one of the worst places an American soldier could have been held during the European War. The psychological impact of captivity was, for many prisoners, worse than the physical suffering because it created a different kind of stress than combat. In combat, soldiers could fight back, could feel they were contributing to something, could maintain the fiction of control over their destiny. In captivity, they were powerless, dependent entirely on their captor's whims, with no ability to affect their situation through action. This powerlessness created psychological trauma that manifested in different ways. Some prisoners became passive and withdrawn, moving through days in a fog of numbness. Others became hypervigilant, unable to sleep, constantly expecting violence. Some maintained hope through elaborate plans for what they'd do after liberation, creating detailed fantasies about returning home. Others lost hope entirely and simply waited to die, showing the phenomenon POW doctors called give-up-itis, the psychological collapse that often preceded physical death. The prisoner community developed its own support structures to combat this psychological decay. Men who'd been teachers before the war organised classes teaching languages or mathematics. Others organised entertainment, staging, plays with no props or costumes, just prisoners acting out scripts they remembered or improvised. Religious services were held despite German prohibitions. These activities served no practical survival purpose. They didn't provide food or warmth, but they served the crucial purpose of maintaining prisoners' sense of identity as human beings rather than as cattle being warehoused until the war ended or they died. The liberation of Stalag 9B and Bulge occurred in early April 1945 as American forces advanced through Germany and German authority collapsed. At Bad Orb, prisoners watching from their barracks saw German guards simply walk away on April 2nd as American tanks approached, leaving the camp undefended and prisoners free to leave. The Americans who entered the camp found approximately 5,000 prisoners, many of them so weak they could barely walk, suffering from malnutrition, disease, and injuries that hadn't healed properly. The liberating forces immediately established field hospitals, brought in food supplies, and began the process of evacuation and repatriation. At Bulge, liberation came on April 23rd, and American forces found conditions that shocked even combat veterans who'd seen concentration camps. Prisoners who weighed 70 or 80 pounds. Men who'd been beaten so severely they had permanent injuries. Bodies of prisoners who died in the final days before liberation. The commanding officer of the American unit that liberated Bulge filed a report describing it as conditions comparable to concentration camps and calling for war crimes investigations. Those investigations eventually led to trials of burger guards, and administrators. Those sentences were generally lighter than those given to concentration camp personnel, reflecting the military justice system's distinction between power camps and camps designed for genocide. Even though the practical distinction for prisoners at Burge had been minimal, the return home for Schnee Eifel prisoners was complicated by psychological trauma that wasn't well understood or treated in 1945. These men had experienced combat, had surrendered, had endured months of captivity under brutal conditions, had watched friends die from causes that seemed senseless. They returned to a country celebrating victory, where civilians wanted to hear stories about heroism, where the cultural narrative emphasized Allied triumph rather than individual suffering. Many prisoners found they couldn't talk about their experiences because civilians didn't want to hear about surrender or captivity. Those stories complicated the victory narrative. Others found they couldn't talk about it because the trauma was too fresh, too painful, too complicated to express in words. Post-war studies of Schnee Eifel survivors showed elevated rates of what we now call PTSD nightmares, hypervigilance, depression, difficulty maintaining relationships or employment. In 1945, these symptoms were often dismissed as weakness or inability to adjust, rather than recognized as normal responses to abnormal trauma. The Veterans Administration provided minimal psychological support, and many survivors simply dealt with their trauma privately, never discussing it, never seeking treatment, carrying it alone until they died decades later. The question of whether the Schnee Eifel surrender could have been avoided haunted survivors for the rest of their lives and generated debates among military historians that continue today. Some argued that the regiments should have attempted breakout earlier, before the German encirclement solidified, accepting heavy casualties but potentially saving the majority of the force. Others argued that breakout was never feasible given German strength, and that surrender was the only realistic option once ammunition and food ran out. Still others argued that the regiments should never have been positioned on the Schnee Eifel in the first place, that the tactical vulnerability of that salient had been obvious, and that proper defensive planning would have prevented the encirclement entirely. All of these arguments contained elements of truth, but they also missed something crucial. The soldiers on the Schnee Eifel didn't choose their positions, didn't decide when or whether to withdraw, didn't determine divisional strategy. They followed orders, fought when ordered to fight, and surrendered when their commanders determined that further resistance was futile. Blaming them for being captured, questioning whether they should have fought harder or tried to escape, placed responsibility on men who had the least control over the circumstances that led to their capture. The Schnee Eifel was a command failure at multiple levels: strategic, operational, tactical. The soldiers paid the price for that failure with months of captivity, permanent psychological trauma, and in 73 cases, at Burge, with their lives. Remembering that captivity means acknowledging that defeat isn't always about courage or determination. Sometimes it's about being given an impossible mission with inadequate resources, and then being blamed when the impossible proves impossible. December 23rd, 1944, morning. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper stands in the village of L'Église, surrounded by the wreckage of his Kampfgruppe, and makes the calculation that every commander dreads: whether to sacrifice his remaining men in continued futile resistance or to abandon everything they fought for and attempt escape. Around him are approximately 800 soldiers. From the original 4,800, the survivors of a week of combat that brought them within 30 miles of the Meuse River before American reinforcements stopped them. His tanks sit silent with empty fuel tanks, impressive machines rendered useless by simple lack of gasoline. His vehicles are burning, destroyed by American artillery, or deliberately set on fire by his own troops to prevent capture. American forces have surrounded his position and are tightening the noose with each passing hour. Piper radios 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters requesting permission to break out on foot, knowing this means abandoning every tank, every vehicle, every piece of heavy equipment his Kampfgruppe possesses. The permission is granted because there is no alternative. The spearhead has become trapped, and saving the men requires sacrificing everything else. It is, in microcosm, the story of the entire German offensive. Initial success, followed by overextension, followed by collapse. The culminating point has been reached, and from here, there is only retreat. The concept of culminating point in military theory describes the moment when an attacking force exhausts its offensive power and becomes vulnerable to counterattack, when momentum shifts from attacker to defender. For the German offensive in the Ardennes, that culminating point occurred around December 24th, when multiple factors converged to halt the advance and begin its reversal. The most immediate factor was fuel exhaustion. German forces had been operating on captured American fuel since December 18th, and by December 24th, even captured supplies were depleted. Tanks sat immobilized, trucks couldn't move supplies forward, artillery pieces that were out of ammunition stayed out of ammunition because transport couldn't reach them. The German logistics system, already strained by years of war and Allied bombing, couldn't deliver sufficient supplies across the lengthening distance from German supply depots to forward combat units. Operational planning had assumed capturing more American fuel dumps, but American engineers had successfully destroyed most major fuel stocks before German forces reached them. The result was an offensive that had run out of gas, literally and figuratively, leaving German units scattered across Belgium without the mobility that had defined German warfare since 1939. The casualty imbalance between the first week and second week of the offensive illustrated how dramatically the situation had shifted. From December 16th through December 23rd, German forces had inflicted approximately 2 casualties for every one they suffered, a favourable ratio typical of successful offensive operations. From December 24th through the end of December, that ratio reversed. German forces suffered approximately 2 casualties for every one they inflicted. This reversal reflected multiple factors: Allied reinforcements arriving in strength, American artillery coordinating fires more effectively as command networks stabilized, American units defending prepared positions rather than being caught in the open, and German units attacking across open ground against entrenched defenders. The Ardennes fighting had always been brutal, but it became a meat grinder for German forces in the offensive's second week, consuming irreplaceable men and equipment faster than the Wehrmacht could sustain. A German staff officer at 5th Panzer Army headquarters later described reviewing casualty reports on December 27th and realizing that continuing the offensive would destroy the attacking divisions even if they weren't. Defeated in combat, they would simply bleed out from accumulated losses. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's recommendation to Hitler on December 24th that the offensive be abandoned was the professional military advice that reality demanded and that Hitler's strategic fantasy prohibited. Von Rundstedt's message was blunt by German staff standards. Objectives were unachievable, casualties were unsustainable, continuing the offensive would destroy Germany's last mobile reserves without corresponding gains. He recommended immediate withdrawal to the West Wall defensive line, which would shorten German defensive frontage and preserve forces for defending against the inevitable Allied spring offensives. Hitler's response was equally blunt. The offensive would continue, new objectives would be designated, and any commander who lacked faith in victory could request relief. This exchange encapsulated the fundamental dysfunction of German high command in the war's final months. Professional military officers understood operational reality, but lacked authority to act on that understanding, while Hitler retained absolute authority but operated in a strategic fantasy disconnected from facts. The result was that German forces continued attacking for another 10 days, achieving nothing except additional casualties, while the opportunity to conduct an organized withdrawal dissolved. The fight for Bastogne became the symbol of Allied resistance and German failure. Even though Bastogne was actually peripheral to the main German axis of advance, the town was surrounded by December 20th, defended by the 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units that had been rushed forward. German forces attacked repeatedly but couldn't break through the perimeter despite local advantages in armour and artillery. The defenders held through a combination of determination, effective command by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and accurate American artillery fire that broke up German assault formations. On December 22nd, German officers presented a surrender demand to McAuliffe, whose one-word response, "nuts," became famous in American military lore, though the German officers who received it needed explanation of American slang before they understood they'd been refused. The symbolic importance of Bastogne was that it represented a place where American forces weren't retreating, weren't being overrun, were holding ground and inflicting losses. When Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne on December 26th, the psychological impact was enormous. The Germans hadn't been able to capture even a surrounded town, suggesting their offensive power was spent. The weather clearing on December 22nd was militarily decisive, but not in ways that made dramatic photographs or newsreel footage. Allied aircraft flew thousands of sorties, but most of them weren't engaging in dogfights or making precision strikes on specific targets. They were systematically destroying German logistics infrastructure. Fighter bombers attacked supply convoys, turning secondary roads into lines of burning vehicles. Medium bombers hit railway marshalling yards, preventing supplies from reaching forward areas by rail. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed German positions, enabling Allied artillery to target headquarters and supply concentrations, and simply the presence of Allied aircraft overhead forced German forces to remain concealed during daylight hours, reducing their operational effectiveness to nighttime operations only. This wasn't glamorous air combat, it was industrial-scale destruction of an enemy's ability to sustain military operations, and it worked. By December 28th, German units were reporting that supply deliveries had been reduced to approximately 20% of what they required, and that continuing operations was becoming impossible not because they lacked soldiers, but because those soldiers lacked fuel, ammunition, and food. The final German offensive actions in late December and early January were characterized by local attacks that achieved temporary gains but couldn't be sustained or exploited. On December 30th, German forces launched attacks against the northern shoulder of the Bulge, hoping to widen the penetration or at least prevent Allied counterattacks from compressing the salient. The attacks failed with heavy casualties. On January 1st, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive air attack against Allied airfields designed to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and regain some measure of air parity. The operation destroyed or damaged approximately 400 Allied aircraft, but cost the Luftwaffe approximately 300 planes and, more crucially, many experienced pilots who were irreplaceable. On January 3rd, Hitler finally authorized withdrawal from the deepest penetrations of the Bulge, accepting reality he'd refused to acknowledge for 2 weeks. The withdrawal was conducted under pressure from American counterattacks, complicated by snow and ice, costly in men and equipment abandoned along roads. By January 16th, when American and British forces met at Hofelize, the Bulge had been eliminated and the front line restored approximately to where it had been on December 15th. The cost accounting of the Battle of the Bulge showed clearly which side could sustain losses and which couldn't. German casualties totaled approximately 125,000 men, 67,000 killed, missing, or wounded, severely enough to require evacuation, plus approximately 60,000 less severe casualties. Tank losses exceeded 600, essentially destroying the panzer divisions that had spearheaded the offensive. Artillery losses were similarly heavy, with hundreds of guns destroyed or abandoned. Germany had no capacity to replace these losses. The manpower pool was exhausted, industrial production was declining under Allied bombing, and logistics infrastructure was collapsing. Allied casualties were also severe. Approximately 75,000 American casualties, including 19,000 killed, plus additional British casualties from operations on the northern shoulder. But the Allies could replace these losses. American industrial production was increasing, replacement soldiers were arriving monthly from the United States, and logistics systems were improving as ports handled more tonnage. The casualty exchange ratio favoured neither side particularly, but the ability to absorb casualties favoured the Allies overwhelmingly, making the Ardennes offensive a strategic disaster for Germany. Even though tactical performance had sometimes been impressive, the impact on Germany's strategic position was catastrophic beyond the immediate battlefield results. The mobile reserves committed to the Ardennes offensive had been stripped from the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were preparing their own massive offensive operation. When that offensive began in mid-January 1945, German forces facing it lacked the reserves needed to contain Soviet breakthrough operations. The result was the rapid Soviet advance through Poland into Germany proper, collapsing the entire German defensive line in the east faster than had seemed possible. Hitler's gamble in the West hadn't just failed, it had directly enabled Soviet success in the East by removing the very forces that might have slowed the Soviet advance. German officers who'd objected to the Ardennes offensive on these grounds had been proven correct, but the validation came too late to matter. Germany was now defending on two fronts with insufficient forces for either facing Allied offensives that would crush remaining resistance in a matter of months. The Ardennes offensive had been described as Germany's last gamble. It would have been more accurate to call it Germany's last suicide attempt, a operation that consumed forces needed for survival in pursuit of objectives that were unachievable even if everything had gone according to plan. The final assessment of what the Ardennes offensive achieved, beyond the immediate casualties and territorial changes, was that it delayed Germany's inevitable defeat by perhaps 6 to 8 weeks. Without the offensive, Allied forces would likely have crossed the Rhine in February rather than March, would have reached central Germany in early spring rather than late spring. The German defensive effort that actually occurred in March and April would have been impossible to sustain without the divisions that were destroyed in the Ardennes. From a purely military standpoint, conducting the offensive made no sense. It consumed irreplaceable resources for minimal strategic gain. But military logic wasn't driving German strategy in late 1944. Political desperation and Hitler's personal psychology were driving it, and both suggested that trying anything, was better than accepting defeat without a final attempt at reversal. The Losheim Gap had been the point where this final attempt began, where German forces achieved their greatest penetration, where the offensive showed both maximum promise and ultimate futility. And when the offensive collapsed, when German forces retreated back through the gap they'd triumphantly advanced through 3 weeks earlier, the gap itself returned to being what it had always been, just a geographic feature, a corridor through hills, a place where armies had marched before and would march again, indifferent to human intentions and human suffering. The Germans had gambled everything on exploiting that gap. They'd lost the gamble, and now they would pay the price for having made it. January 13th, 1945, dawn. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Herlong stands in frozen darkness, briefing his officers from the 82nd Airborne Division about the attack that will begin in 2 hours, and he's conscious that he's describing an offensive operation that's actually a recovery operation, retaking ground the Americans had held a month ago and lost through surprise. The objective is Losheim village, the same village where Private Newborough had been manning an observation post on December 16th when the world exploded. Between December and now, Losheim has been in German hands, has been fought over, has been destroyed and abandoned, and now must be recaptured. Herlong's paratroopers are experienced soldiers who fought in Normandy and Holland, but they're also exhausted from 3 weeks of continuous defensive combat during the German offensive. They're attacking in terrain that favours defenders, in weather that makes movement difficult, against German forces that have had time to prepare positions. The attack plan is straightforward because there's no clever way to do this. Advance east, clear the Germans out, re-establish the front line where it should have been all along. Nobody mentions that they're recovering from a defeat, that this attack is necessary because someone failed to defend this ground a month ago. But everyone knows it, and everyone is determined to make sure that when this attack is finished, the Losheim Gap will never be vulnerable again. The American counteroffensive in mid-January was less a dramatic assault than a methodical compression of the German salient, squeezing from both north and south until German forces withdrew or were destroyed. From the north, 1st and 9th armies under Montgomery's temporary command pushed south toward Hofelize. From the south, Patton's 3rd Army attacked north toward the same objective. In the center, where the Losheim Gap had been breached, American forces advanced eastward with the immediate goal of recapturing the ground lost in December and the longer-term goal of reaching the German frontier and preparing for the eventual crossing of the Rhine. This wasn't the kind of warfare that generated heroic narratives. It was grinding, attritional combat in terrible weather against an enemy that was beaten but still dangerous, retreating but still capable of inflicting casualties. The Americans were learning what the Germans had discovered during their offensive. Winter warfare in the Ardennes was miserable for everyone, attackers and defenders alike, and victories were measured in yards gained rather than miles. The recapture of Losheim on January 17th was both tactically simple and emotionally resonant for the American units involved. The village had been thoroughly destroyed, first by German artillery in December, then by American counterfire in January, leaving mostly rubble and burned buildings. German resistance was determined but not overwhelming. The defenders knew they were being pushed back, were conducting delaying actions rather than defending to the death. American forces cleared the village building by building, a process that took most of the day despite the village's small size. The significance wasn't the tactical difficulty, but the symbolic importance. This was where the gap had been breached, where American cavalry had been overwhelmed, where the entire catastrophe had begun. Recapturing it represented closing the gap literally and symbolically. When American engineers planted American flags on what remained of Losheim's church, The act was less about victory celebration than about reclaiming something that had been lost and ensuring it wouldn't be lost again. The discovery of frozen American dead during the January advance was a grim reminder of December's disasters and a task that fell to Graves' registration units following the combat troops. In forests and fields around Losheim on the Schnee Eifel ridge, in villages that had been fought over repeatedly, American bodies lay where they'd fallen in December, frozen solid, sometimes buried in snow. Graves' registration teams photographed the bodies, collected identification tags, attempted to determine circumstances of death, and prepared the remains for temporary burial until they could be repatriated. The process was emotionally devastating for the soldiers conducting it. These were comrades who'd died while Graves' registration personnel were evacuating, men who'd been alive a month ago and who'd now been frozen in the attitudes of death for weeks. Some bodies showed evidence of execution, hands bound, single gunshot wounds to the head suggesting they'd been prisoners killed by their captors. Others showed evidence of fighting to the last, empty weapons, defensive positions improvised from whatever cover was available, and some appeared to have simply frozen to death, soldiers who'd been wounded and unable to move, who'd died slowly over hours in the December cold. The Graves' registration reports from January 1945 made clinical reading remains recovered grid coordinates, followed by technical details, but behind each report was a human story of suffering that the clinical language couldn't capture. The discovery of the Malmedy massacre site in mid-January, when American forces finally reached the Bonyas crossroads where 84 prisoners had been murdered, created an immediate demand for investigation and prosecution that would extend through the end of the war and beyond. American investigators documented the site systematically, photographing the field where prisoners had been shot, excavating bodies from snow and frozen ground, collecting shell casings and other physical evidence, interviewing Belgian civilians who'd witnessed the massacre. The evidence was overwhelming. This hadn't been prisoners killed during combat or in the confusion of battle. This had been deliberate mass murder of surrendered men. The investigation identified SS soldiers from Kampfgruppe Piper as perpetrators, and Piper himself was named as bearing command responsibility. The case became one of the highest profile war crimes investigations in the European theatre, partly because of the number of victims, partly because the victims were Americans, and partly because the massacre had become known throughout American forces, affecting morale and attitudes toward German prisoners. The trial wouldn't begin until 1946, but the investigation began immediately upon recapture of the site, driven by a combination of legitimate legal process and desire for justice that bordered on vengeance. The retaking of the Schnee Eifel positions in late January was emotionally complex for American soldiers who knew what had happened there in December. The ridgeline was deserted when American forces reached it. German troops had withdrawn days earlier, recognizing the positions were no longer defensible and not worth the casualties required to hold them. American soldiers walking through the positions found evidence of the December fighting and surrender, abandoned equipment, frozen supplies, bunkers that had been occupied until recently. Some units found personal effects that had belonged to the surrendered regiments, letters, photographs, equipment marked with specific units, poignant reminders that 7,000 American soldiers had been marched into captivity from these positions. The recapture was unopposed, which meant it was tactically easy but emotionally difficult. There was no victory in reclaiming ground that should never have been lost, no satisfaction in occupying positions where entire regiments had been captured. The soldiers who retook the Schnee Eifel did so knowing they were recovering from someone else's disaster, and that knowledge created a complicated mix of emotions: anger at the commanders who'd allowed the disaster, sympathy for the soldiers who'd been captured, determination that it wouldn't happen again. The engineering effort that followed the January advance focused on ensuring the Losheim Gap would never again be vulnerable to the kind of exploitation the Germans had achieved. American engineers surveyed the terrain, identified key defensive positions, and began constructing permanent fortifications that incorporated lessons learned from December. The approach was methodical. Dominant terrain was fortified with bunkers and observation posts that provided interlocking fields of fire. Roads through the gap were prepared for demolition, with explosives pre-positioned so bridges and causeways could be destroyed if necessary. Minefields were laid in areas that channeled movement, creating kill zones that would slow any future attack. Supply dumps were positioned with multiple access routes so they couldn't be easily cut off. Communication lines were buried or heavily duplicated so they couldn't be severed by infiltrators or artillery fire. The work continued through February and March, long after the immediate threat had passed, because the institutional imperative was clear. The Losheim Gap had been exploited once, and the army was determined it would never be exploited again. Whether this preparation was militarily necessary, given that Germany was clearly losing the war and another offensive was unlikely, was less important than the organizational need to demonstrate that mistakes had been identified, corrected. The civilians who returned to Losheim and surrounding villages in late January and February found homes destroyed, possessions looted or burned, and communities that had been caught between armies for 6 weeks. Belgian and German civilians, the border ran through this region, had experienced occupation, liberation, reoccupation, and liberation again, with each transition bringing danger and loss. Some families had lost members to crossfire or to deliberate violence when soldiers from either side decided civilians were aiding the enemy. Others had lost homes and livelihoods to artillery fire and combat damage. The reconstruction effort that began in spring 1945 was massive, involving clearing rubble, rebuilding infrastructure, and providing humanitarian assistance to populations that had been traumatized by months of warfare. American civil affairs units worked with Belgian authorities to coordinate reconstruction, but progress was slow because resources were focused on military operations rather than civilian relief. For the people who lived in the Losheim Gap, the battle wasn't history, it was lived experience that had destroyed their communities and would affect their lives for years. The soldiers moved on to the next battle, but the civilians had to stay and rebuild from ruins. By February 1st, the Allied front line had been restored approximately to where it stood on December 15th, and the immediate crisis had passed. The Losheim Gap was back under American control, fortified against future attacks, no longer a vulnerability in the defensive line, but the cost of that restoration had been enormous. Thousands killed, tens of thousands wounded, months of operational delay, while the Allies refocused from offensive operations to defensive containment and then back to offensive operations. The question that would occupy military analysts for decades was whether this cost was necessary, whether the disaster could have been prevented with better intelligence, better dispositions, better command decisions. The answer was almost certainly yes. The intelligence failures, deployment errors, and command confusion that enabled the German breakthrough were avoidable mistakes. But acknowledging mistakes doesn't undo consequences, and the consequences of the Losheim Gap breakthrough were paid in blood and suffering by soldiers who had no control over the decisions that made their suffering necessary. The gap had been breached, then closed, then recaptured. The soldiers who accomplished each of these phases did so, believing they were doing their duty, following orders, serving their country. Whether their sacrifices were necessary or whether they were the inevitable price of others' failures was a question each soldier answered privately, if they answered it at all. The gap itself, indifferent to human suffering, returned to being what it had always been, a corridor through hills where armies marched and where soldiers died, a geographic feature that mattered only because humans assigned it, meaning the meaning assigned in January 1945 was that it was ground that had been lost and must be recovered, regardless of cost. And so it was recovered and the armies moved on, leaving behind graves and ruins and memories that would never entirely fade. February 14th, 1945, morning. Major Dwight Fanton of the U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps stands in a frozen field near Bourniez, Belgium, watching technicians excavate bodies from ground that's been thawing irregularly, making the work both physically difficult and emotionally devastating. Fanton is 32 years old, was a prosecutor in civilian life, and has been assigned to investigate what American soldiers are calling the Malmedy Massacre, the murder of 84 American prisoners by German forces on December 17th. The bodies have been in the ground for nearly 2 months, preserved by winter cold, and excavating them requires systematic documentation, photographing positions, collecting evidence, identifying remains when possible. This is Fanton's third war crimes investigation site in 2 weeks, but Malmedy is different because the victims are Americans, because the number is large, and because the massacre has become symbolic of something larger than the specific incident. As technicians carefully expose another body, hands still bound with wire, single bullet wound to the back of the head, Fanton makes notes for the report that will eventually result in the largest American war crimes trial in the European theatre. He knows this case will be complicated, controversial, and emotionally charged. What he doesn't know yet is that the trial will raise questions about American conduct as well as German, and that achieving justice will prove more difficult than simply documenting crimes. The investigation of the Ardennes massacre expanded quickly from documenting a single incident to investigating a pattern of prisoner killings during the German offensive, and the scope of what investigators discovered complicated the narrative of German atrocity and American innocence. The Malmedy massacre was real, was documented, was unambiguous murder of prisoners who'd surrendered and were under guard, but investigators also documented approximately 20 to 30 incidents where American forces had killed German prisoners, sometimes in retaliation for Malmedy, sometimes in the chaos of combat, sometimes for reasons that were never clearly established. These incidents were smaller in scale, 1 or 2 prisoners shot rather than 84, but they represented violations of the same laws of war that the prosecution would invoke against German defendants. The investigation board faced an uncomfortable question. Could America prosecute German soldiers for killing American prisoners while ignoring American soldiers killing German prisoners? The legal answer was yes, victors have always held vanquished to standards they don't apply to themselves. But the moral answer was more complex, and that complexity would shadow the entire war crimes process. The Malmedy trial opened in May 1946 at the former Dachau concentration camp, a location choice that was symbolically significant but legally questionable. Joachim Peiper and 73 other defendants faced charges ranging from direct participation in killing prisoners to command responsibility for subordinates' actions. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. German soldiers had machine-gunned American prisoners in a field, had finished off wounded survivors with pistol shots, had murdered men who'd surrendered and were entitled to protection under Geneva Convention rules. Belgian civilian witnesses testified about what they'd seen. American survivors testified about watching their comrades being killed. Medical examiners testified about autopsy findings consistent with execution rather than combat deaths. The evidence was overwhelming that a massacre had occurred. What remained less clear was individual responsibility. Which defendants had actually fired weapons, which had given orders, which had simply been present without participating. Military law held commanders responsible for their subordinates' actions, but where was the line between command responsibility and individual guilt? The defense strategy focused on 2 arguments that would become central to post-war debates about war crimes prosecution. First, the defense argued that American interrogators had used torture and coercion to extract confessions from defendants, making those confessions legally inadmissible. Defendants testified about beatings, mock executions, threats against family members, and psychological pressure that broke them down. American interrogators denied most of these allegations, but admitted to tactics that would have violated American criminal procedure standards, though they argued that military justice during war required different standards than civilian justice during peace. Second, the defense argued that even if atrocities occurred, individual soldiers couldn't be held responsible for following orders in the chaos of combat, particularly when those orders came from superior officers who were also following orders from higher command. This superior orders defense had been explicitly rejected at Nuremberg, where the principle was established that individuals are responsible for their own actions regardless of orders. But the Malmedy defendants argued there was a difference between systematic genocide and battlefield atrocities committed in the stress of combat. The prosecution responded that stress doesn't excuse murder, and that following orders doesn't absolve soldiers of responsibility for killing prisoners. The verdicts handed down in July 1946 reflected the complexity of assigning individual guilt for collective crimes. 43 defendants received death sentences, including Peiper. 22 received life imprisonment. 8 received lesser sentences. 1 was acquitted. The sentences suggested the court believed both that atrocities had occurred and that many defendants bore responsibility. But the sheer number of death sentences, nearly 2/3 of all defendants, suggested a judicial process that was more focused on collective punishment than on individual justice. The sentences sparked immediate controversy. German public opinion saw them as victors' justice, disproportionate punishment that ignored mitigating circumstances. Some American observers questioned whether the trial had been fair, whether coerced confessions had been properly excluded, whether the standard of proof had been sufficient, and veterans organizations began lobbying for sentence reviews, arguing that whatever the defendants had done, they'd been soldiers following orders in combat, not war criminals who'd committed premeditated murder. The controversy would extend for years, with all death sentences eventually commuted and most prisoners released by the mid-1950s. The investigation of atrocities at Bulge labor camp revealed a different category of war crime that was less controversial legally but equally disturbing in its particulars. Bulge wasn't a battlefield incident where the chaos of combat might provide some explanation for prohibited conduct. It was systematic brutality against prisoners over 3 months in a camp setting where guards had complete control. American investigators documented beatings that resulted in death, medical neglect that caused preventable deaths, work requirements that exceeded human physical capacity intentionally, and execution of prisoners who couldn't work. Unlike Malmedy, where the defense could argue combat stress and confusion, there was no comparable explanation for what happened at Bulge. This was deliberate cruelty toward helpless prisoners, conducted far from any battlefield, over an extended period. The trial of Bulge guards and administrators in 1947 resulted in convictions that were less controversial than Malmedy because the evidence was less ambiguous and the conduct was so clearly criminal. But the sentences were generally lighter years in prison rather than death because the victims, though American, had been POWs rather than combat soldiers, and because the crimes, though systematic, hadn't resulted in the dramatic single-incident mass casualty event that Malmedy represented. The disparity in sentences between Malmedy and Bulge suggested that military justice was influenced by public visibility and emotional impact, as much as by legal severity of crimes. The question of American war crimes during the Ardennes campaign was investigated quietly, but never resulted in prosecutions, reflecting both legal complications and political calculation. Army investigators documented multiple incidents where American soldiers had killed German prisoners, had refused surrender offers, had committed acts that violated laws of war. In some cases, these acts were direct retaliation for Malmedy American soldiers, explicitly stating they were killing German prisoners because Germans had killed American prisoners. In other cases, they were the result of battlefield stress, confusion, or individual decisions by soldiers who weren't thinking about legal niceties. The investigation board concluded that while violations had occurred, prosecution was impractical for several reasons. Evidence was limited because incidents had occurred in combat conditions without witnesses beyond participants. Defendants were difficult to identify because units had been mixed together during the fighting, and most importantly, prosecution would be politically impossible because it would appear to create moral equivalence between American soldiers defending their country and SS soldiers who'd murdered prisoners. The board's recommendation was that no prosecutions be pursued, but that training be improved to emphasize prisoner treatment requirements. This essentially meant that American war crimes would be handled through institutional reform rather than individual accountability, while German war crimes would be handled through trials and punishment. The broader legacy of war crimes prosecution from the Ardennes campaign raised questions that extended far beyond specific cases and would influence international law development for decades. The Malmedy trial established precedents about command responsibility, about the admissibility of coerced confessions, about the line between lawful combat and war crimes. But it also demonstrated the difficulties of achieving justice in cases where victors judged vanquished, where cultural and linguistic barriers complicated testimony, where standards of evidence were uncertain. Post-war legal scholars debated whether the Malmedy trial had been fair or had simply been retribution dressed in legal language. Some argued that the trial had been essential for establishing the principle that soldiers could be held accountable for atrocities even during combat. Others argued that the trial had set dangerous precedents for victors' justice that undermined the legitimacy of international law. Both positions contained truth. War crimes prosecution was necessary to establish that some conduct was prohibited regardless of military necessity, but the Malmedy prosecution specifically had been flawed in ways that raised legitimate questions about whether the process had been just. The personal aftermath for participants in the war crimes trials was complicated and often tragic. Joachim Peiper, whose death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment and who was eventually released in 1956 after serving 11 years, attempted to live quietly but found that notoriety prevented normal life. He moved to France under an assumed name, worked as a translator, and tried to put his past behind him. In 1976, his identity was discovered, and shortly thereafter his house was firebombed, killing him. Whether this was revenge for Malmedy, political assassination, or something else was never determined, but the violent end seemed fitting for a man whose most significant historical act had been enabling violence. Other defendants who'd been released attempted similar quiet lives with varying success. Some integrated into post-war German society, others were ostracized, others couldn't escape their past psychologically even after being freed legally. And the survivors of the massacre, those 43 Americans who'd escaped the field at Barrage, carried trauma that trials and verdicts couldn't heal. Some testified at the trial and found the experience cathartic. Others refused to participate, finding that reliving the massacre was more painful than helpful. All of them lived with memories of December 17th, 1944, and with the knowledge that justice, whatever it meant, couldn't undo what had happened. The memory of war crimes from the Ardennes campaign became entangled with broader narratives about World War II, about American virtue and German criminality, about the moral clarity of the Allied cause. Malmedy fit neatly into a narrative where Americans were liberators and Germans were perpetrators, where American conduct was honourable and German conduct was criminal. This narrative was emotionally satisfying and politically useful, but historically incomplete. The reality was more complex. Both sides committed violations, both sides killed prisoners, both sides operated in a moral grey area where the laws of war were guides rather than absolute constraints. Acknowledging this complexity doesn't create moral equivalence. The systematic atrocities of the Nazi regime were different in kind and scale from tactical violations by Allied soldiers. But it does require acknowledging that war brings out the worst in all participants, that stress and fear and anger override legal training and moral conditioning, and that prosecuting war crimes is as much about political necessity as about legal justice. The Losheim Gap had been the site where the German offensive began, and Barrage was the site where that offensive was most clearly marked by criminal conduct. But both sites were also marked by human complexity that simple narratives of good versus evil couldn't fully capture. The reckoning for crimes committed during the battle would extend through trials and appeals and clemency decisions for more than a decade after the war ended. And even then, the reckoning would be incomplete because justice for mass atrocity is always incomplete. You can prosecute individuals, can establish legal precedents, can create historical record, but you cannot undo the acts themselves, cannot restore the victims, cannot make whole what violence has broken. The best you can do is establish that some conduct is prohibited and will be punished, and hope that future soldiers facing similar situations will remember that laws of war exist, even when war itself seems lawless. June 1947 afternoon, Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, Chief Historian of the European Theatre of Operations, sits in a War Department conference room in Washington presenting preliminary findings from the U.S. Army's official historical study of the Ardennes campaign. Around the table sit generals and colonels who commanded units during the battle, staff officers who planned operations, intelligence officers who processed information. Marshall's presentation is systematic, walking through the sequence of decisions and events that led to the German breakthrough at the Losheim Gap, and his analysis is damning without being explicitly accusatory. He describes how intelligence warnings were ignored, how defensive positions were inadequate, how command structures weren't prepared for the kind of offensive the Germans launched. A general interrupts, "Colonel, are you saying this disaster was preventable?" Marshall's response is careful. "Sir, every military disaster looks preventable in hindsight. The question isn't whether we could have done things differently, we obviously could have. The question is whether we should have known to do things differently based on what we knew at the time. This distinction between what should have been known and what could have been known would define historical debate about the Losheim Gap for decades, separating critics who saw inexcusable failures from apologists who saw reasonable decisions that unfortunately proved wrong. The resource constraint explanation for American defensive weakness in the Ardennes centered on a mathematical reality that no amount of operational skill could overcome. Eisenhower simply didn't have enough divisions to defend everywhere in strength. By December 1944, Allied forces were defending a 450-mile front from the North Sea to Switzerland. Standard military doctrine suggested that properly defending that frontage required approximately 45 divisions organized into corps and armies with appropriate reserves. Eisenhower had 61 divisions total in Northwest Europe, which sounds like more than enough until You account for the fact that divisions couldn't all be on the front line simultaneously. Some were resting, some were refitting, some were in reserve for offensive operations. The actual frontline strength was approximately 23 divisions, roughly half of what doctrine required for proper defense. This meant choices had to be made about where to concentrate strength and where to accept risk. The Ardennes was chosen as an acceptable risk sector based on terrain assessment and the assumption that Germans lacked offensive capability. The assessment proved catastrophically wrong, but it wasn't unreasonable given what Allied planners believed they knew about German strength and intentions. The intelligence failure explanation focused on systemic issues rather than individual mistakes, arguing that Allied intelligence in December 1944 suffered from institutional blindness created by months of success. Intelligence organizations are designed to find what they're looking for, and in late 1944, Allied intelligence was looking for evidence of German weakness and German defensive preparations. Information that contradicted this expectation was reinterpreted until it fit the narrative or was dismissed as anomalous. Ultra-intercepts that showed reduced German radio traffic were interpreted as evidence of disorganization rather than as evidence of communication discipline. Aerial reconnaissance that showed German vehicle concentrations was interpreted as defensive preparations rather than offensive preparations. Prisoner interrogations that revealed improved German morale were interpreted as individual outliers rather than as indicators of improved overall German capability. This wasn't conspiracy or incompetence, it was normal human cognitive bias amplified through large organizational structures. Intelligence officers were working hard, analyzing information carefully, and reaching conclusions that seemed reasonable based on their operating assumptions. The problem was that their operating assumptions were wrong, and wrong assumptions make good analysis produce bad conclusions. The doctrine gap explanation argued that the U.S. Army in December 1944 was doctrinally and psychologically prepared for offensive operations, but not for serious defensive challenges. American military training since before the war had emphasized offensive maneuver warfare, reflecting both American military tradition and the specific requirements of defeating Nazi Germany. Defensive operations were treated as temporary conditions that preceded resuming the offense, not as complex operations requiring specialized training and preparation. This meant American commanders thought about defense primarily as how to stop here before attacking again, rather than as how to defend against a major enemy offensive. The defensive positions in the Ardennes reflected this orientation. They were adequate for holding against German patrol activity and minor attacks, but weren't prepared for major offensive operations. Minefields were incomplete, obstacles were improvised, communication systems were vulnerable, reserve positions weren't prepared. These deficiencies weren't from laziness or incompetence, but from institutional focus on offense rather than defense. And that institutional focus reflected strategic choices about how the war would be won. The coalition warfare explanation examined how British-American cooperation created vulnerabilities despite overall effectiveness. Eisenhower commanded a coalition force that required balancing American and British strategic preferences, operational methods, and political requirements. Montgomery wanted concentrated offensives in the north, aimed at the Ruhr industrial region. Patton wanted aggressive offensives in the south toward the Saar. Bradley wanted broad-front advance that wouldn't favour either ally. The compromise was simultaneous offensives in multiple sectors, which required spreading forces more thinly than concentration doctrine recommended. The Ardennes became the economy sector, the place where minimum forces held while strength concentrated elsewhere, because it was between the American sectors in the south and the British-American sectors in the north. This wasn't wrong strategically, but it did create vulnerability operationally, and that vulnerability was exploited by German planning that identified the seam between major Allied efforts. Coalition warfare always creates such seams, places where command boundaries and national sensitivities limit coordination. The question isn't whether seams exist, but whether they're protected adequately, and in December 1944, the Ardennes seam wasn't protected adequately. The comparative analysis of the Ardennes offensive versus the Mortain counteroffensive in August 1944 illustrated what went right when Germany attacked at Mortain and what went wrong when Germany attacked in the Ardennes. At Mortain, German forces attacked American positions in Normandy, attempting to cut through to the coast and trap Allied forces. American intelligence detected the preparations, American forces were prepared, and the attack was defeated decisively. The differences between Mortain and the Ardennes were instructive. At Mortain, American forces held shorter defensive frontage with more troops, ultra-intelligence provided strategic warning that was acted upon, and American positions were prepared for defense. In the Ardennes, American forces held longer frontage with fewer troops, intelligence warnings were dismissed, and positions weren't prepared for major attack. The tactical performance of American soldiers was comparable, they fought effectively in both battles, but the operational and strategic conditions were dramatically different. Mortain succeeded because the system worked, intelligence detected the threat, commanders responded appropriately, resources were available to meet the challenge. The Ardennes failed because the system failed. Intelligence was ignored, commanders didn't respond until too late, resources weren't positioned to meet the challenge. Both battles involved German attacks against American defenses, but outcomes were determined by preparation and response rather than by soldier quality or tactical skill. The role of luck versus competence in military operations was examined through analysis of what would have changed if specific events had occurred differently. What if weather hadn't favoured the Germans in the first week, allowing Allied air power to engage immediately? What if telephone lines at key headquarters hadn't been cut by German infiltrators, allowing faster communication and coordination? What if the 106th Division had been positioned differently, or if the 14th Cavalry Group had received reinforcements before December 16th? Historical analysis using counterfactual scenarios is methodologically problematic. You can't know what would have happened because it didn't happen, but it's useful for distinguishing between deterministic outcomes and contingent outcomes. Some aspects of the Ardennes offensive were nearly deterministic. Germany lacked the logistics capacity to reach Antwerp regardless of tactical success. Allied material superiority would eventually prevail. German strategic situation was hopeless regardless of operational victories. Other aspects were highly contingent, whether the initial breakthrough would be contained quickly or would develop into crisis, whether specific American units would be destroyed or would escape, whether casualties would be thousands or tens of thousands. The distinction mattered because deterministic outcomes suggest systemic factors that no individual decisions could change, while contingent outcomes suggest that different choices might have produced different results. The institutional response to the Ardennes breakthrough included multiple reforms designed to prevent recurrence of the specific failures that enabled German success. Intelligence procedures were revised to ensure that dissenting analyses reached decision-makers rather than being filtered out by intermediate staffs. Defensive doctrine was updated to emphasize the possibility of major enemy offensives even when strategic situations suggested enemy defeat. Communication redundancy was improved to ensure that command networks couldn't be disrupted by single points of failure. Reserve positioning was revised to allow faster response to unexpected threats. Training programs incorporated lessons about defensive operations under conditions of surprise and confusion. These reforms were implemented in 1945 and 1946, incorporated into the Army's institutional knowledge, and influenced Cold War planning when American forces faced potential Soviet offensives in Europe. Whether the reforms were necessary or were examples of preparing to fight the last war was debatable. The specific circumstances of December 1944, a major surprise offensive by a supposedly beaten enemy, seemed unlikely to recur. But military institutions learn from failure more effectively than from success, and the Ardennes failures were dramatic enough to drive institutional change. The final assessment presented in Colonel Marshall's report acknowledged multiple contributing factors without assigning primary blame to any single cause. The Losheim Gap breakthrough happened because of intelligence failure and resource constraints and doctrinal gaps and coalition seam vulnerabilities and contingent bad luck. No single factor was sufficient to explain the disaster, and no single reform would have prevented it. This was intellectually honest but institutionally unsatisfying because organizations want clear causation and definitive lessons. It was complicated, and multiple things went wrong simultaneously is accurate analysis but poor guidance for future action. So, the institutional lessons that emerged from Marshall's analysis were simplified. Improve intelligence processes, maintain adequate reserves, prepare better defensive positions, ensure robust communications. These lessons were actionable, which made them institutionally useful even if they oversimplified the complex reality Marshall's analysis had described. Military institutions need simple lessons because simple lessons can be taught, trained, and incorporated into doctrine. Complex lessons that acknowledge the role of chance, that recognize irreducible uncertainty, that admit some disasters happen despite reasonable precautions. These lessons are intellectually honest but operationally paralyzing. So the army learned the simple lessons, improved the specific failures that had been identified, and prepared itself to face different challenges in future wars. The Losheim Gap would not be breached again, but that was partly because the specific circumstances that allowed its breach in December 1944 would never recur. The army had learned from the disaster, whether it had learnt the right lessons or had simply learned to avoid the specific mistakes of December 1944, was a question each future generation of officers would have to answer for themselves when facing their own unexpected challenges. December 16th, 1994, morning, 50 years to the day after the German offensive began, a group of elderly men stand in the village square of Losheim, Belgium, some wearing American Veterans Association jackets, others in civilian clothes with military decorations pinned to their chests. They are survivors, men who fought here in December 1944, who survived the initial onslaught, who lived through the following weeks of combat or captivity. The Belgian government has erected a memorial, a simple stone marker listing the units that fought here and the dates of the battle. A local official gives a speech about remembering sacrifice and honouring liberators. A U.S. Army colonel representing the Department of Defense thanks the veterans for their service. The ceremony is dignified, but small. Losheim's battle isn't famous like Bastogne, doesn't attract the crowds or media attention that other World War II sites receive. The men standing here know this, and some are bitter about it, feeling that their sacrifice has been forgotten while more celebrated battles are memorialized. But others understand that historical memory is selective, that some battles become famous while others fade, and that the importance of what they did here isn't measured by how many people remember it. They know what happened. The people of Losheim know what happened, and that knowledge, passed to children and grandchildren, preserved in local memory, if not national consciousness, is its own form of memorial, more lasting than stone. The institutional military legacy of the Losheim Gap breakthrough influenced American military doctrine and planning throughout the Cold War in ways that were sometimes explicit and sometimes subtle. The U.S. Army's shift toward active defense doctrine in the 1970s and 80s, the concept that defending forces should conduct aggressive counterattacks rather than purely static defense, drew directly from Ardennes. Lessons. The emphasis on defending against Soviet breakthrough operations in Central Europe specifically referenced the Losheim Gap as an example of what could happen when defensive positions were inadequate and surprise was achieved. NATO defensive planning in West Germany explicitly avoided creating the kind of gaps and seams that had existed in the Ardennes, ensuring that sectors were properly resourced and that reserve forces were positioned to respond to unexpected penetrations. Whether this planning was appropriate for the Cold War threat, whether Soviet operational methods resembled German methods from 1944 was debatable, but the institutional memory of the Ardennes failure influenced an entire generation of planners who were determined not to repeat that specific disaster. The intelligence community reforms that followed the Ardennes breakthrough had lasting impact on how the United States processes strategic intelligence. The establishment of the Army Security Agency and later the National Security Agency traced its origins partly to lessons about signals intelligence failure in December 1944. The emphasis on providing dissenting analyses to decision makers, on ensuring that intelligence that contradicts prevailing assumptions reaches top levels rather than being filtered out, became standard practice in post-war intelligence organizations. The creation of the position of National Intelligence Officer, whose role is specifically to challenge consensus views and present alternative analyses, reflected lessons about how the US intelligence community had failed to challenge the assumption that Germany couldn't mount major offensives. These reforms didn't prevent all intelligence failures, Vietnam, the Iranian Revolution, September 11th, but they created mechanisms designed to reduce the specific type of failure that enabled the Ardennes surprise. Whether those mechanisms actually prevented failures or simply made failures more bureaucratically complicated is debatable, but the attempt reflected institutional learning from the Losheim Gap disaster. The veterans of the 106th Infantry Division and 14th Cavalry Group maintained active association throughout the Cold War, holding annual reunions that served both social and therapeutic purposes. These reunions were places where men who'd shared trauma could process it with others who understood, where experiences that civilians couldn't relate to were common knowledge, where the question, "What happened to you in December 44?" didn't require extensive explanation. The early reunions in the late 1940s and 50s focused on reconnection, finding surviving comrades, comparing experiences, filling gaps in personal knowledge about what had happened. Later reunions in the 60s through 80s became more reflective, with veterans processing their experiences through the lens of age and perspective, discussing what the battle meant, debating whether their commanders had failed them or whether they'd simply been unlucky. The final reunions in the 1990s and 2000s became explicitly memorial, with declining numbers of survivors recognizing these might be the last opportunities to gather. The 106th Division Association held its last official reunion in 2012, with fewer than 50 survivors attending, most in their late 80s or 90s. The organization formally dissolved, transferring its records to the National Archives and its memorials to the care of local historical societies. The physical gathering of survivors ended, but the legacy of shared experience continued through families who'd heard the stories, through historical records that preserved testimony, through the collective memory of a division that had been broken in its first major battle and had carried that experience for the rest of their lives. The question of why Losheim remained relatively obscure while Bastogne became famous illustrated how historical memory is shaped by narrative convenience rather than military significance. Bastogne had everything needed for compelling narrative: surrounded defenders, a charismatic commander with a memorable quote, "Nuts," successful relief, clear victory. Losheim had none of this. Surprise defenders, overwhelmed positions, surrender and retreat, ambiguous outcomes. Bastogne fit the narrative of American heroism and ultimate triumph. Losheim represented American vulnerability and partial failure. Popular history gravitates towards stories that confirm national mythology, and Bastogne confirmed while Losheim complicated. This wasn't conspiracy or deliberate distortion, it was normal historical memory selecting for stories that serve cultural purposes. Every nation does this, emphasizing victories and minimizing defeats, celebrating heroes and downplaying failures. The fact that military historians and specialists knew about Losheim while general public didn't reflected this natural selection process. For the men who fought at Losheim, this obscurity was sometimes frustrating. They'd fought as hard as the soldiers at Bastogne, had suffered as much, had done their duty under more difficult circumstances. But obscurity also had advantages. It meant their battle wasn't mythologized, wasn't turned into simplified narrative that erased complexity, wasn't used for purposes beyond the veterans' control. They could remember it as it actually was, rather than as public memory required it to be. The physical landscape of the Losheim Gap preserved relatively little evidence of the battle by the 21st century. Unlike some World War II battlefields that were preserved as historical sites, the Losheim area returned to normal civilian-use farms, villages, forests. Occasional bunkers remained in wooded areas, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. A few memorials marked specific incidents. Local museums displayed artifacts and photographs. But most of the battlefield landscape showed no evidence that armies had fought there 70 years earlier. This absence of physical markers meant that understanding the battle required imagination and historical knowledge rather than visceral response to preserved battlefield. Veterans visiting in old age often commented that they couldn't find the specific locations they remembered. Roads had been moved, buildings demolished and rebuilt, forests cleared or replanted. The landscape had moved on even if their memories hadn't, creating a disconnect between internal memory and external reality. This geographic amnesia was in some ways appropriate. The battle had been about people and decisions more than about terrain, and the terrain returning to peaceful purposes suggested that the destruction had been temporary, even if the consequences had been permanent. The Belgian civilian memory of the battle focused on different aspects than American military memory, emphasizing displacement, loss, and resilience rather than tactics and command decisions. Belgian families who'd lived through the battle transmitted stories about hiding in cellars during artillery barrages, about losing homes and possessions, about being caught between armies that treated civilians as obstacles or potential enemies. The liberation by American forces in September 1944 had been celebrated, but the return of German forces in December had been traumatic. The brief taste of freedom, followed by renewed occupation, created psychological whiplash. The final liberation in January 1945 brought relief, but also awareness of massive destruction that would take years to repair. Belgian commemoration of the battle emphasized civilian suffering and recovery more than military operations, reflecting different stakes in the battle's outcome. For American soldiers, the battle was an episode in their military service, important but bounded by other experiences. For Belgian civilians, the battle was destruction of their homes and communities, an event that divided their lives into before and after. This difference in perspective meant that American and Belgian memory of the battle didn't always align. What Americans remembered as military operations, Belgians remembered as personal disasters. The use of the Losheim Gap battle in military education evolved over decades, reflecting changing pedagogical purposes. In the immediate post-war period, the battle was taught primarily as a cautionary tale about intelligence failure and inadequate defensive preparation, what not to do. By the Cold War period, it was taught as a case study in Soviet-style breakthrough operations and appropriate defensive responses, how to counter similar threats from the USSR. In the post-Cold War period, it was taught as an example of how institutional assumptions can blind organizations to emerging threats, a broader lesson about avoiding cognitive bias. By the 21st century, it was taught as historical case study with contemporary relevance to surprise attacks and asymmetric warfare, showing that technologically superior forces can still be caught off guard. Each pedagogical use emphasized different aspects of the battle, interpreting the same historical events through contemporary concerns. This wasn't distortion, it was normal educational practice of making historical examples relevant to current students. But it meant that what students learned about Losheim depended as much on when they studied it as on what actually happened there. The personal legacy for individual soldiers who fought at Losheim varied tremendously based on their specific experiences and their psychological resilience. Some veterans successfully integrated the experience into their life narratives, viewing it as a difficult period they'd survived and moved beyond. They had successful careers, families, normal post-war lives, and could discuss the battle without undue emotional distress. Others struggled for decades with trauma that wouldn't resolve, experiencing nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty maintaining relationships, all symptoms of what we now call PTSD, but what was poorly understood in the 1940s and 50s. Some veterans who'd been captured carried guilt about surrendering, even though their surrender had been ordered and had been militarily necessary. Others who'd escaped carried survivor's guilt about comrades who'd been killed or captured. And some veterans processed their experiences by becoming active in veterans organizations, giving testimony to historians, educating younger generations, turning their trauma into purpose by ensuring the lessons were preserved. There was no single veteran experience of Losheim. Just as there was no single battle experience, each man's war was unique, even though it occurred in the same place at the same time. The final question that the Losheim Gap battle raised for each generation of students and historians was whether the disaster had been necessary, whether it taught lessons that couldn't have been learned more cheaply, whether the price paid was justified by the value received. The cynical answer was no. The battle was a disaster caused by avoidable mistakes. The lessons it taught could have been learned through better planning and intelligence. The soldiers who died or were captured paid the price for their commanders' failures. The pragmatic answer was yes. Organizations learn more from failure than from success. The reforms prompted by the disaster probably prevented worse disasters in future conflicts. The institutional knowledge gained was valuable even if the cost was terrible. Both answers contain truth. The battle was avoidable in the sense that better dispositions and better intelligence would have prevented the specific disaster. But the broader vulnerability, coalition seams, resource constraints, institutional assumptions might have manifested differently, if not at Losheim, and the lessons learned might have been necessary for the Army's evolution into a more effective institution. Military organizations exist in a permanent state of tension between preparing for past threats and anticipating future threats, between correcting known weaknesses and accepting risk in other areas. The Losheim Gap exposed weaknesses that the U.S. Army subsequently corrected, that it took a disaster to expose those weaknesses, said something about how institutions learn, that the lessons were learned and implemented, said something about institutional resilience, and That individual soldiers paid the price for institutional education, raised moral questions about the relationship between individuals and the organizations they serve, questions that each generation answers differently, but that never fully resolve. The Losheim Gap returned to being what it had always been, beneath the historical significance humans projected onto it. A geographic feature, a corridor through hills, a place where terrain channeled movement. Armies had marched through it in 1870, in 1914, in 1944. Between these military episodes, it was farmland and villages and forest where people lived normal lives. After 1944, it returned to being farmland and villages and forest again. The Gap didn't care about the meanings assigned to it, didn't remember the suffering that occurred within its boundaries, didn't commemorate the thousands who died there. That work, the work of memory, of commemoration, of learning, was human work, performed by survivors and historians and educators who believed that past suffering should generate future wisdom. Whether it actually did, whether the lessons were learned properly, whether the sacrifices were honoured adequately, were questions each generation had to answer for itself. The men who fought at Losheim in December 1944 did their duty as they understood it under circumstances beyond their control. Some survived and carried the experience for the rest of their lives. Others died and were remembered by those who survived them. All of them participated in something larger than themselves, a battle that changed lives and influenced history in ways both intended and unintended. The Gap itself, indifferent to human drama, remains a corridor through hills where armies once marched and where the land has long since healed, even if the memories never entirely did. This is the legacy of Losheim. Not grand narrative or simple lessons, but complex history of human beings doing their best in terrible circumstances, succeeding sometimes and failing sometimes, and always being more complicated than the stories we tell about them suggest. End of documentary.